Welcome, and thank you for joining today's Market Surveillance Committee meeting. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the WebEx chat panel by using the associated icon located at the bottom right of your screen. And please note that all audio connections are muted for the duration of the call to minimize background noise. If you would like to ask a question, you can do so by clicking on the raise hand icon located above your chat panel. And if you are only dialed into the phone line, you may press #2 to raise your hand. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. With that, I'll turn the conference over to Dr. Benjamin Hobbs, Chair of the Market Surveillance Committee. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chris. I apologize for the frog in my throat, everybody, but I hope that I'm clear. Welcome to the general session of the Market Surveillance Committee, and I'm pleased to have my colleagues Jim Bushnell and Scott Harvey here with me, and we also have ISO staff, Shami Davis, Greg Cook, Brad Cooper, John Gooden, Gabe Murtaugh, Danny Johnson, Guillermo Bautista, and Bill Weaver. So we have two major items on the agenda today. One is the Resource Sufficiency Evaluation Phase 2 for Western EIM, and the other one concerns storage, and there are two sub-agenda items there. One is on state of charge constraint for storage resources that are providing ancillary services, and the other one is on the energy storage enhancements. The first agenda item, which will be starting in a couple minutes, is going to be presented by Danny Johnson and Brad Cooper. Dr. Guillermo Bautista Alderete will also be participating, no doubt. But before we go into that, as always, we open up the mics for public comment and questions. And if you could limit yourself to questions and issues that are not that wouldn't be covered in later agenda items, I'd appreciate that. So at this point, can you indicate to Chris, the operator, that you would like to get on the line if you would like to do so? Chris, is there anybody queued up?
At this point, I see no hands raised.
Okay. I don't doubt that the folks on the line will overcome this initial shyness later. We'll have a very active discussion. So I would therefore like to hand over the virtual podium to Danny Johnson with Brad Cooper to talk about WIM, Resource Sufficiency Evaluation Enhancements, Phase 2. Danny?
Great. Yes, thank you, Ben. Can we move to the next slide? So we started off this Resource Sufficiency Evaluation Phase 2 initiative earlier this summer. This is really a follow-up to the Phase 1 enhancements we made through the latter part of 2021. It looks to add additional accuracy enhancements, as well as address an idea that I think that was put forth by the MSC and a lot of our governance members in the February meeting of trying to leverage the WEIM to increase reliability. Out of this initiative, we really have three modifications to the design of the RSE that we're looking for feedback on. The first would be the CAISO's, or the change to adjust the CAISO BAA RSE obligation to not count for low priority exports that could clear in the real-time market against advisory WEIM transfers. The second change is to change the tagging requirements for those LPT exports out of the CAISO BAA. I think we would look to have these tagged as firm provisional. We view this as an extension of the existing market scheduling priorities. We're just extending that through the HAS process. The final topic that we'll discuss today is the idea to provide energy assistance through an assistance energy transfer in the WEIM to a BAA who may be in an undersupplied or have a condition where they lack the necessary flexibility to ramp between loads. We would look to do this through a hurdle rate. This tacks on a cost to the transfer, and I think that's something that we will be looking for your feedback on. But these are kind of high level, the three topics that we're looking to discuss today. Can we go to the next slide? So the first topic, this did pop up in the first RSCE initiative, and then Guillermo and the market validation and analysis team did quite a bit of analysis this spring on this topic, and it's really examining how LPTs are referenced in the CAISO's RSE obligation against maybe how those are clearing in the HAS market itself. And what the analysis found is that the HAS can clear LPT exports that are based on advisory WEM transfers or intertie import bids. These then get added to the CAISO BAA's RSE obligation. However, the advisory WEM transfers are not able to count as supply for the CAISO BAA. This is due to the explicit rule that doesn't allow one BAA's WEM supply offers to be counted for another. This, in our eyes, kind of created an asymmetric situation where the CAISO is being held to an export standard based off exports that it doesn't guarantee at the same level to its load or high priority exports. In fact, we think that this can actually cause the CAISO BAA to fail, even though the CAISO may have sufficient supply to address its own obligations that have its load and high priority obligations. We proposed a couple different iterations of this. We started off trying to dynamically determine which quantity of LPT exports can't be supported by the CAISO BAA. I think in an ideal world, this would be the most accurate test, but the feedback we heard with that is even if you do that, there's not much that other BAAs can do with that information. If CAISO said some of these are essentially firm, equal priority to load, some of them aren't, they wouldn't have sufficient time in the operational horizon when the RSE is being conducted to adjust their base schedules to make up for that fact. So the next iteration of the proposal, we said, okay, if there's no real reason to dynamically try to make this test more complicated and figure out what quantity can be supported, just don't count any of them. The principle is the CAISO BAA will curtail LPTs before risking its own load or its PT exports. And so if that's the case and the RSE is really looking to test for the load serving obligations of each BAA, then that's a satisfactory approach. We heard further feedback that this may be a little bit of an overreach, and an idea that we heard on the draft final proposal call was to look to only discount the real-time LPT exports from the CAISO's RSE test to count the day-ahead obligations. Our logic with this was that the WEAM advisory supply offers, which are one of the primary drivers of this asymmetry, aren't present when you're on the day-ahead market. So ideally, the LPTs that get cleared of the day-ahead have gone through the RUC process. There should be supply to support those transfers. They're then also required to rebid into the real-time market, and if they are not cleared, or if there's still sufficient supply, they'd be cleared. If there isn't, then they would be curtailed through that. So this seemed like a reasonable approach to us to try to figure out what the CAISO BAA's RSE obligation should be regarding its own demand and then exports that it would have a confidence of standing behind. So I don't know if you have any questions on this or if we should move on, or if the audience may.
Yeah, Danny, I just had a few, maybe you'll get to this a little bit later too, but I was trying to understand sort of what an analogous situation would be for bilateral transactions. And I think there's this distinction between the tagging process and the firmness of the product that I'd like to, just make sure I'm understanding, because I got from some stakeholder comments that that this is sort of treating non-firm exports as if the receiving BAA can use them to comply, which maybe you're getting to on the next slide. And others were sort of saying, well, that's kind of what happens with bilateral transactions as well. And so I'm wondering how you view this treatment of HASP LPT relative to those sorts of bilateral hourly block transactions, to the extent they are comparable.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I'm not sure that they are super comparable, and the real difference is just that our HASP is optimally clearing these based off the entire footprint's supply stack. So whether it's a firm transaction or a non-firm, for an EIM, WAM, BAA to represent that on their base schedule, they should have a reasonable expectation that they're going to stand behind it. Like, I don't think we have any criteria that specifies the quality of transmission that has to be used on the base schedules that are submitted to the CAISO, but we would expect that each BAA is accurately representing the interchange that they believe that they can support and that they stand behind. And for the CAISO BAA, we're not able to do that due to the dynamics of clearing the HASP process, clearing the HASP. So the second point that I think you raised is the asymmetry. Frankly, that's something that we've struggled with too. It wouldn't make it, on its surface, it doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense to allow those to be counted on the sync end of the transaction. What we heard is that even if we can give them a dynamic amount that would have to be adjusted for, WMBAs don't think that they would functionally be able to update base schedules in time. And then it's just asking the question of, are these transactions that the vast majority of the time are going to be there and are going to flow? If those aren't accounted for, then it's fairly inefficient from a market outcome, because the WMBAs are going to have to be base scheduling significant additional resources online to meet their RSE, even though a lot of their transactions may be these LPT exports, which in most cases we would expect to flow.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, this is Brad. I, like Danny said, the big difference is, we're clearing stuff out of our market where other BAAs, when they're entering into bilateral transactions, they can calculate exactly what extra capacity they have and only sell that amount. But our market will clear what it's going to clear, including being supported by transfers in. And then regarding the tagging, some entities have said, this firm provisional isn't appropriate. It should be non-firm. And I don't have it handy, but we looked up the definition of non-firm, which pretty much says they can be cut for any reason whatsoever, which we don't think LPTs are. We're not going to cut them for any reason whatsoever. We're going to cut them in specific circumstances. So they're, lack of better words, somewhere between firm and non-firm, and that's where we landed on the firm provisional.
Okay, yeah, I was actually, my comments were more, or my question was more directed at the treatment of the import side of this. I totally understand the difference, or the sort of unique position the CAISO's in with regards to the kind of co-optimization of HASP and the EIM advisories. So I agree with that sort of aspect of it. I'm kind of more trying to feel out the implications of the export side. And like Danny said, I think there's this, it seems like there's a very different sort of set of circumstances when we are approaching a period where we might actually contemplate these transactions being curtailed, which may be a very small fraction of the time. My next question is going to be whether any of these were curtailed during the heat wave. So you can think about that while I finish this statement. And so, yeah, I guess I'm just trying to think about whether a bilateral I guess the answer is there is no such thing as a bilateral provisionally firm, so we don't quite know how to compare that even on the receiving end. But I think a theme we're going to sort of hit a couple times in this discussion also is whether there's a way that some of this stuff could better distinguish between periods of kind of regional scarcity and periods where there really isn't any reasonable expectation that we would curtail these exports or that there might be regional scarcity. And it seems like a few aspects of the design, would really benefit from somehow being able to differentiate those circumstances. So anyways, that's my statement. The question is, was there any curtailment of LPT exports during this last heat wave?
First, before I turn it over to Guillermo, I wanted to kind of highlight something that you said, Jim, which I think is pretty accurate. We did hear in the comments that firm provisional, what is this? Nobody uses this designation. And to us, I'd almost said, yeah, this is the right level. Like no other BAA in the West operates anything that looks like the HASP, where everything is bilaterally handled. So this does kind of fit that designation between firm and non-firm. I know we did curtail some LPTs during the heat wave, but I would turn it over to Guillermo because I think he's more tuned in with kind of what occurred.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Well, I will just reinforce that. We did observe curtailments of low priority exports, some of them coming from the day ahead, some of them coming straight into the real time. And just as an advertisement, we are putting together all the areas of investigation we are doing for the heat event. And as you may recall, we have the summer performance report that we are producing for every month of the summer. September will not be the exception. Indeed, we're going to put more attention and it's going to be more robust given all the activities that happen for the heat wave. And that includes the implications of the intertie scales, such as the curtailment that we apply for either the day ahead or the real time for the low priority exports.
And under current policy, I forget, are day ahead low priority today sort of given a higher priority to something that would be scheduled hour ahead?
I think so, because we have the differentiation between day ahead and real time. I would have to confirm the numbers, but the expectation, I believe, is yes.
But I believe that the part of this initiative is going to make that more explicit and make clear that day ahead is a higher priority than the real-time low priority, or did I misread that?
So I think I can help with that. There is, up until the HASP, I think they're separated by $100 penalty price in the scheduling run. I think what we would look to do through this initiative is to ensure that our operators can easily like manually make or manually assign priority to the day ahead and real time curtailments with the same like logic and reasoning that we have currently in our tariff.
Yeah, this is Brad. Just to be clear, we're not proposing to change the priorities and HASP of LPT exports, and like Danny and Guillermo said, that the day ahead have a little bit higher priority than real-time LPT exports, which both are lower than load.
Right. Okay, so day ahead does already have a.
Yeah.
I think one's 1150 and one's 1250 in the scheduling run, if I'm remembering correctly.
Okay, is your next topic off of LPT? Because we can probably take stakeholder feedback on this aspect, I guess. Scott, I didn't quite get if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I want to follow up on something Danny said and that some of the stakeholders said about they wouldn't have time to react to this. I mean, they wouldn't have time to react if their bids didn't clear, right? So, I mean, they should be prepared in any case to have other resources to cover any imports they're bidding for in HASP from the CAISO, because they have no idea whether the bids are going to clear anyway. So I don't see that the potential for it to anything here about these things not clearing or not getting high priority they should be prepared for that in any case.
So Scott, I would agree on a BAA-specific basis. That makes sense. When we've spoken to some of the different EIM BAAs, the concern we've heard is that they use third-party marketers to fulfill firm energy contracts that are firm when they get delivered to them. And so they may not be the parties that are placing the LPT export bids on the CAISO. They just know that I have a contract with a marketer that's saying they're going to deliver power at this node. And so I think that's what they're representing.
But if they're contracting with a party that might or might not clear, shouldn't they have other capacity to enable them to meet their obligations? I mean, it seems like whether if they've got Joe, if I'm the one who's doing it, and they know that I don't have capacity, it seems like they have to be prepared for the potential for it not to clear.
And Scott, I think this is a very key point because the differentiation of priorities between the day and between the high and low priorities precisely to differentiate those that really have the high priority, that have a non-array resource supporting that export. Anything else that comes in is basically just a position for price takers to see if they can clear them, basically beyond the economics, but still that gives them a slightly higher priority than an economical bid, but that's it, and therefore there is no guarantee that they are going to be able to flow. Even if there is a low priority exports coming into the day-ahead market, there is no expectation that it should be firm and clear right there from the day ahead. We have issued curtailments this summer, like also in the previous summer, for this type of exports, and they have a very nice window there to realize that in the day-ahead time frame, they were not able to clear successfully, so there is time lead there for them to realize that there is other alternatives. Now, even if they clear the day ahead, potentially they may continue to submit a bid for the real time to see if they are able to clear. If the day ahead was curtailing those exports, there is a good indication that they may not be able to be accommodated in the real time. So showing up with a price taker position in the real time is not a condition for firmness. It's just if there are conditions, they may, but may not be able to clear. So the window of opportunity from the day ahead is there to realize whether they can flow or not, and potentially it's a good indication of how tight it's going to be for the next day.
I don't know. And it seems to me there are indicators we know, like going into the day, like is it a warning day? And like on a warning days where we know we're in trouble already, why would we allow these to be counted? And maybe set it up that way. So on a day when it's a mild spring day and everything's gonna flow, we count everything. But when we get into a EAA1 situation, it seems a little odd to be doing this.
Say, Chris, can you see if anybody's on the phone lines?
So we do have one caller in queue.
Okay. Welcome.
Hey, this is Michelle Keto from the CPC. I just have a quick question. When you guys talk about curtailing LPT exports, are you really saying they just didn't clear the market, not that we curtailed them?
At least when I think of it, Michelle, I think it's both.
Okay.
The market, they don't clear the HASP, or potentially operators, when they're actually well after the HASP, would need to curtail these.
Okay.
Sorry,
okay.
Guillermo, I interrupted you.
No, yeah, I would say my own answers have been more in regards to what the market has been doing recently, and that is export reductions through the market mechanism.
And you're
but
calling
as
those
Dan indicated, there may be also conditions in which the operators have to take action to do curtailment. That will be after the market.
Okay, that's a very different context than what we've just been discussing, though. If it was just sort of a market action, rather than actual curtailment.
And the market does the curtailment because of these penalty factors. I mean, I think they blur together now that we've got these rules in place, that the software is going to do the curtailments based on the penalty factors. And it's, the market's going to operate based on those penalty factors that we've built in and agreed upon.
But if the market is curtailing, so if I'm understanding this, the HASP is curtailing the day ahead.
No, real-time self-scheduled exports first.
The real-time Then what is the implication for the RSE in that circumstance?
No exports are counted in the RSE, right? No LPT exports under the CAISO's proposal.
For the CAISO, but those imports are counted for other people, even if they're going to get curtailed.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm again focused on the receiving end, just trying to understand the inconsistency there.
Yeah. So this is Michelle. I'll note another inconsistency. We cut the imports, the untagged T-45 imports that might be supporting those exports. So imagine that we can't count them, but other folks could potentially count the exports that were effectuated by those. So that's another inconsistency, right? So HASP clears. We have the imports. The imports fail the imports clear the exports. The imports fail at T-45. Those exports are counted in other EIM balancing authorities. But I'm not arguing against that right now, but I would note that as well. So my other question was just that this isn't necessarily just a WEAM advisory issue, right? It's also a HASP issue, and that HASP is not binding, and so we clear the exports, and then the imbalance charges for imports that don't show up are only 75% of the highest of the 15-minute or the 5-minute market, so they don't necessarily have incentives to show up under stress system conditions, and yet the exports are potentially going out. And so we'll talk about that later, but I do have some issues that we don't cut. Well, anyway, I'll talk about that later. I just wanted to say it's not just a WEAM advisory issue, it's also a HASP issue. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Anybody else on the phone line, Chris?
Currently, I have no one else with their hands raised.
Okay. We'll continue then.
Okay. Well, then I think we can go to the next slide. So the proposal, I think this is the previous slide. We need one more slide forward.
Let's go to the second, experiencing technical issues.
Sure. It's still on slide 3 for everybody else?
It is for me.
Okay.
Yes. Danny, is there anything else you might want to discuss while Chris takes care of this?
Yeah, I think one point of clarification that I can make is, and it may have gotten lost in the previous discussion, but after the HASP is run, the curtailments do become manual. I don't think we're looking for the FMM right now to be implementing these curtailments due to all the reasons that we could go short in those more narrow time windows. But I do see Michelle is going to help us try to fill the time while we get through the technical difficulties too. So thank you, Michelle, in advance.
Sure, Danny, Michelle Keeter from the CPUC, but aren't there penalty provisions in your BPM that prioritize the LPT exports overload, and isn't that used in the FMM in the 5-minute market?
My understanding is that CAISO demand and PT exports should have priority. To the extent that there is something else in the BPM, I think I'd defer to Guillermo. He may have better insight into what it's saying.
Yeah, I can help on that, Danny. And I don't know, Michelle, if this is the nature of your question, but let me try to give an answer. The scheduling priorities that we define in either the tariff or in more detail in the BPM are applicable to the market where the interties are optimized. Effectively, you have to make an economical decision, what clears first, what is reduced second, and it is here where the scaling priorities play a role because it's going to tell you what is the sequence, the right sequencing of these reductions. When we are talking about, for instance, hourly interties, it is the HASP market where these scaling priorities play a role because you are deciding whether to clear an export, reduce an export, or clear an economical bid. And therefore, the scaling priorities are going to be effectuating that sequencing. Once we move into a subsequent market like the 15-minute market or the 5-minute market, we are still running an optimization. We are still achieving a least cost optimization. However, in those markets, for instance, we don't optimize the hourly intertie, right? They are already past the market. In here, we are basically taking into account whatever was already clear and tagged into the 15-minute market. They become an input to consider the supply that they are adding or the demand that they are adding. And in that case, these scaling priorities are no longer at play because we are not making an economical decision of what is the optimal combination of interties. That was already done in HASP. In FMM, basically, we are carrying over what was already awarded and tagged into the system. Therefore, they are not variables in the optimization to redefine what the optimization should be doing to those interties. And therefore, in this case, the scaling priorities of low priority and high priority or anything else is not really relevant to this market.
Okay, so Guillermo, this is going to lead into my discussion of the idea of the emergency energy. That means that when you run the 15-minute and the 5-minute market, you're going to have those LPT exports that will potentially be supported by those emergency wean transfers. So we can talk about that later, but that seems to me very problematic. But I'll wait for that discussion. So thanks.
I think we're back on track, Danny, if you want to move on. Slide 4.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, I think we're up to slide 4 now. So I wanted to call this out. We've already touched on this, but the ISO is not proposing any changes to how LPT exports from the CAISO BAA are represented in the WEIM entity-based schedules. We did initially propose to try to dynamically calculate and issue pro rata haircuts on these schedules. The feedback we got, not unanimous, but almost overwhelmingly from stakeholders, is that this would be very hard to do operationally, and they would prefer to continue to represent these in their base schedules. And given that that's a strongly supported stakeholder position, it's what we are proposing in the draft final proposal. So it does create a bit of an asymmetry because the sink side and the source side would be counted differently for different WEIM BAAs, but ultimately this would seem to be a position and an asymmetry that the majority of stakeholders would be comfortable with.
So is it true that the vast majority of HASP schedules are then going to be LPT? What's an example of a
PT?
Yeah. Could there...
So a PT would be a neighboring BAA or one of their component members has forward contracted with a non-RA resource internal to the CAISO and gotten transmission to export out of the CAISO BAA. They then are able to designate that this resource bid in our cyber application is associated with the PT export, and essentially that export through our market systems is given equal priority to CAISO load. We effectively don't deem that internal generator as being dedicated to meeting CAISO BAA load. It is it's committed elsewhere essentially, and we try to respect that through the market. The remainder of the economy energy exports that aren't associated with specific resources would be LPT exports.
Yeah, sorry. I was so focused on the sort of wheel through paradigm that I get that the internal non-RA resources could be part of this. Although I don't really have a good sense of the magnitude of those. But yeah, anything that is sort of an export that's supported by an import anticipated. So it seems like this maybe gets back to Scott's comment that that this wouldn't be that unpredictable. Like if you're using HASP and you know you don't have a counterparty that's a non-RA resource, you kind of know already that that you're not going to be able to supplement your base schedule through HASP, basically. And so I don't quite get the timing sort of arguments here.
I think it still gets back to who is supplying these schedules. And I think what we've heard in the EDAM sphere is these are often WSPP Schedule C schedules, which are these schedules that in the day ahead time frame don't have firm sources of energy or transmission all the time. They're a marketer saying, I'm going to give you X megawatts at this point of delivery. And then as you roll through the different market timelines, eventually that does get firmed up. And at least anecdotally, what we've heard in the EDAM process is these tend to be very reliable. There's a business reputational risk for the marketers on top of the liquidated damage clauses. Like if you don't deliver in tight system conditions, going forward, nobody's going to be doing business with you. So the feedback we've heard from WEAM BAAs is these tend to be highly reliable. I think that I'd like to see if any WEAM BAA wants to weigh in on that and maybe add a little bit more color, but I'm not sure how much information the BAA operator and the market operator at the desk in each BAA has on who's fulfilling these contracts and what cleared day ahead rock and what didn't.
It doesn't seem to me like it's a very reliable contract if they're counting on buying it out of the HASP during a tight day. I just don't, that doesn't connect to me at all. I mean, I can see for a wheel through coming through where they've got generation in the Pacific Northwest and they're wheeling it through, then there's a reputation. But I don't see how we can support a reputation on putting bids in on a day where the CAISO's in EAA2 and saying they're hoping to buy power out.
Yeah, that's a fair point, Scott, and I can't disagree with that. And I think, in fact, we saw during the really stressed heat wave conditions earlier this month, there were a number of LPTs that were trying to buy out of the CAISO, buy economy energy out of the CAISO market. So.
Operator, is anybody taking the bait on the phone lines? Jump in on this, or?
Looks like we just got Jeff who jumped in. Jeff, go ahead.
Thank you. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. I just wanted to provide some thoughts kind of generally on the discussion here. First of all, I think when CAISO originally raised the concern, we've been supportive of trying to address this issue, and in particular where there's this interaction between the EIM with the HASP, and there is the potential for that interaction to essentially produce exports through the HASP. They're supported by advisory EIM imports, and that can cause challenges for the CAISO in passing the resource efficiency test. And I think we agree that we need to find a reasonable solution for that. And I think some of the elements here are heading in the right direction. But the treatment that we're discussing here around the import side of these transactions is an area that I think is really important. And the way we've been kind of thinking about the challenge here is, number one, we need to classify what is the set of lower priority exports that we're talking about. And I think that it's clear, just listening to the discussion, that there's multiple ways you could do that. You could say all exports that, whether they're day ahead or real time, if they don't clear RUC, then that's the bucket we're looking at. Or you could try to narrow it down and say we're trying to only look at real-time exports, or even more narrow, only look at real-time exports that were supported by EIM imports. And I get that it's more difficult to narrow it down that specifically as you get closer to real-time. But I think from our point of view, no matter how that bucket is ultimately defined, the key is, number one, that those transactions are very clearly and transparently identified on the E-tag so that it's clear to all of the parties in the transaction about the nature of that schedule and whether or not it is subject to curtailment. And I think that that alone is one of the improvements that would help with some of the issues that Danny was just referring to, where the receiver of that energy may not be the one that actually has the relationship with the CAISO, because there could be intermediate parties that are attempting, they either have exported from the CAISO or they're attempting to export from the CAISO, and then they've turned around and sold that power in the bilateral markets to another entity, so on and so forth, until ultimately it's delivered to some BA in the Western grid. And so that need for transparency on the E-tag is something that communicates to everyone exactly what the transaction reflects, and that provides that clarity above and beyond just the entity that's actually submitting the bids with the CAISO. Once that occurs, though, once this set of exports has been classified, it's transparently identified as being lower priority, we're comfortable with, at that point, saying those exports are excluded from the CAISO BA's resource sufficiency test. But in our view, that has to come with the symmetric treatment on the other side, because otherwise, really, it's just double counting, to the extent that what is happening, if you kind of take a step back, is you're saying the CAISO BA is effectively excluding that export from its resource sufficiency obligation, recognizing that it could curtail that export and use that supply to meet its own needs, at the very same time that there's some other entity that's bringing that same energy supply into its BA and saying, I can use that to meet my needs. And clearly those both can't be true at the same time. And so I think, in our view, just to kind of summarize, there's certainly some opportunities to try to figure out what's the right bucket we're talking about. How do we address the CAISO's original issue and do it in a way that's consistent with identifying that, appropriate category of lower priority exports. But once we've done that, it needs to be clearly identified, and it absolutely has to be treated in a symmetric way within the test, because otherwise we just think that it's adding inaccuracies through double counting. So I just wanted to provide that higher level feedback on our perspective on this topic, and recognizing it's a complicated one.
Okay. When we heard about the overwhelming support for this slide, we heard from the stakeholder that was not part of the overwhelming support. So I guess, absent any other commenters, we can move on.
I think I see Robert in the queue. Robert from NDE, Jim.
I don't have my queue thing on.
This is Robert Fisher with NG Energy. I just want to bring up a point that Danny brought up in his initial discussion, is that we're discussing stress system conditions in which we are obviously, as a EIM entity, aware that there are going to be stress system conditions and exports have the potential to be curtailed. What that results in is if there's third-party aspects in our area, we have to buy twice as much. And so that twice as much energy to cover that potential HASS curtailment that can occur, HASS or RUC curtailment, is what's going to occur. But the key point that Danny brought up is this is for the rest of the year. there may be purchases for the rest of the year, absent 2 weeks out of the 52 weeks of the year, where these purchases are going to clear just fine. So if you're going to purchase energy from it and it's not going to count towards your resource efficiency evaluation, it's just another reason why you would not want to purchase energy from CAISO. And so that was part of the reason in regards to saying that the import side should still count towards your resource efficiency, because this is reliable capacity, and during those stress system conditions, we're obviously going to go out and try to cover that, because there is the potential for that to be, a very high potential for that to be curtailed. And when that energy actually does, you're expecting it to curtail, it ends up going right back to CAISO as a wiggle through, just to kind of point that out as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. I got to say, my reaction here and with the emergency energy thing that we'll talk about later is that, yeah, there's the discussion of a lot of this has really focused on the system emergency situation, and hasn't really thought as much about the implications for the non-system emergency situations. But it seems like there should be ways to be able to differentiate and have, for example, I think Scott already proposed it, like we'll exclude these from the from the RSE only when, I don't know, it might be considered too subjective if an emergency, some level 1 or 2 has been declared, but there should be some kind of objective trigger status. That
I think the difficulty, comes in knowing how much is being supported in the HAS process through transfers, right? It's clear with the objective that was shown that those that the data shows that imports through transfers can support exports, which is perfectly reasonable if you ask me, because it's really kind of a marketing aspect. And so it's difficult to tell the quantity of the size that is being supported by those transfers. When maybe a portion of it could be coming from a generator through economics or some of them, or through some net importing. So I think the difficulty comes in that aspect, but that's just my guess. Jim, I want to kind of address something you said, and I think you're bringing up a fair point of what are the rule sets in stress system conditions against what are the rule sets in not stress system conditions. And the other thing that I probably should have mentioned at the beginning of this discussion is this is an incredibly expedited initiative to try to have something in place by next summer. And when we were thinking about this internally, when you start trying to define what is a stressed and not stressed system condition, I think back to our system market power discussion, where we spent numerous iterations trying to decompose the bilateral hub prices, propose just flat energy prices to try to define this. And that to us seemed like this may be worth doing, but I think in the timeline we're trying to get something in place by probably wouldn't have allowed for policy discussion on what's the right level of stress, what's the right level and signifier for stress system conditions for the different applications of these rules.
Okay, although if this is sort of the quick and dirty solution that we're looking for, then kind of the emergency alert level maybe is something we could live with for a transition period. Okay. This will come up again because
it's a fair point. Yeah. No, it's a fair point, because like the first time we tried to do this, our thought was to try to dynamically calculate what are the quantities of these LPTs that do fall into this category of being cleared through advisory supply offers. And at that point, that's even better than kind of the quick and dirty way to do it. So once we got feedback that wasn't something that stakeholders were on board with, we kind of pulled back and took a more generalist approach of like, what would be more generally supported. So fair point, Jim.
Well, okay. I mean, I guess it seems like we've gone in two separate tracks. They're sort of identifying how much is really coming, from the advisory EIM part versus maybe just, internal generation that's selling energy or something like that. And it strikes me as neither should really be counted on during an emergency. And so I'm not sure either really belongs in a base schedule during an emergency. And so it seems like your proposal here is a pretty straightforward way, consistent with kind of other practices of defining the quantity. But then there's just sort of the question of, should you count that quantity both in the CAISO's obligation and in the receiving importer's base schedule? And it's just sort of that part, the measure would be the same all the time, but there'd just be a trigger that says, okay, during some circumstance, to be defined as an emergency circumstance, we won't count these as part of a base schedule. Anyways, that would be one way to think.
That's a fair observation.
I just want to point, we also have to think about the implications for next summer if we do this and how it'll play out. Because it seems to me what will happen is the CAISO will clear EIM imports to support exports. And because we basically, at this point, we have a zero shadow price for FlexiRamp in the EIM bubble around the CAISO, then unless that gets fixed, we'll drain the EIM bubble around the CAISO of all the unloaded capacity and use it, turn it into exports that are supported by these EIM transfers. And then we go into real time and everybody passed the test, but they're really, we don't have any unloaded capacity anywhere except in the CAISO, that the rest of the EIM has been denuded of it.
Again, fair point, Scott. Assuming we can fix FRP, which I think we're on track to having the FRP refinements in place, I think what I fall back on the reliability side of this is this shouldn't create reliability harm in the WEIM, because the WEIM, when it ran HASP, it found that there was enough supply to back these LPTs, essentially, even if there's disagreement on who should get account for it in the RSC. The market results should be feasible. And then you go into the more, or the sequential markets, and we have that constraint that doesn't allow an WEIM export transfer if PBC has been relaxed or if ABC has been exercised. So that's kind of a second layer of protection for different EIM BAAs, that they're not being put in a bad position from a reliability perspective by this. But again, you're right, this is predicated somewhat on FRP getting fixed.
It'll protect the exporter from having shed load, but it still seems to me to set up a situation where everything says we're okay going into real time, but actually we're not. That we've got no unloaded capacity in the rest of the EIM. Now that's already happening now, but that's part of the problem. That we're doing this laundering through the CAISO, in which the FlexiRamp gets dissipated and sucked out of all the rest of the EIM around the CAISO, and then we're inevitably much tighter than we wanted to be in real time. But there is a downside. Now, it doesn't really matter if there's nothing else we can do, I guess. But it does sort of mask the fact of that there's big time trouble when we're clearing these exports that are really supported by not just unloaded capacity, but by eliminating all the FlexiRamp and the rest of the EIM, or the EIM within the constrained bubble. But you get the point. So I'm worried about it.
No, I very much do. And fingers crossed the FRP implementation goes in a couple months, and it's starting to actually produce that shadow price for flexibility that we want, which should hopefully go towards solving this problem.
I agree. If it works as we hope,
yeah.
I think this will be a lot less troubling and a lot of this. But we might not even need the export fix if we fix that. But we can't count on everything being wonderful when we plug in the dispatch. We'll just have to see.
Agree.
All right, let's
sure
on, I guess.
Yep. Can we go to the next slide, operator? Okay, so this is kind of the second part of this change, and this is how the exports would be tagged coming out of the CAISO system. We're proposing that these have a E-tag as a firm provisional export. You can see the definitions embedded in this slide. Essentially, this really does kind of place them somewhere between firm, equal priority to your own load, and non-firm, which can be curtailed for any reason. We're still not going to look to curtail through the market after the HASP any of these exports. We do envision this being manual, but would look to have the following curtailment priority respected by our system operators. So the highest priority obviously goes to ISO demand and high priority exports. A second tier would be day-ahead LPT exports. The third tier is real-time price-taking LPT exports. So these are your real-time self-scheduled exports. And the final priority wouldn't even be cleared by or would be real-time economic exports, which I guess could be cleared by HASP, but due to some intervening circumstances, need to have curtailment on. We are looking kind of on the implementation side to give our operators better tools to more easily kind of issue the pro rata curtailments to the extent necessary based off this priority list. So we do envision that as being an enhancement for the system operations and our ability to manage the system next summer. That comes out of this initiative. And Jim, I think we have a question.
Hey, this is Michelle from the CPC. Would all of these LPT exports that are proposed to be firm provisional, would they be cut before we did any emergency assistance?
I don't think that we're proposing, Michelle, to explicitly put bounds on that. That would be at operator discretion.
So we could potentially have a situation where HASP imports or WEAM advisory imports supports a whole lot of LPT exports, and for some reason we fail the RSE test by 10 megawatts, and then we could potentially have to pay to support those 3,000 or 4,000 megawatts of LPT exports with $2,000 or $4,000 prices. Is that right?
Well, I'd push back on that a little bit because there's really two conditions for that assistance energy transfer. First, you have to be short of energy. Second, you actually have to also fail the RSE. So ideally, if we're getting it right on what LPTs are counted in the CAISO BA's RSE obligation, the CAISO shouldn't be failing the RSE with thousands of megawatts of kind of unsupported LPT exports from WAM transfers. So I think
right. But
the point you're raising is valid.
Losing
I mean, there's the potential for, yeah, I'm sorry, go on.
Yeah, I mean, you could lose a transmission line, your wind forecast could be off, and that could go into an RSE failure. It could be a minor RSE failure. It could just be 5 megawatts, right? And then we'd still have to pay the new scarcity pricing on 4,000 megawatts of exports, right?
Well, I'm not sure because if any of these things occur before HASP, then it would have to be re-cleared through the HASP market.
Right.
The risk that I think you're identifying is that intervening period between when the HASP is run and RTPD6 is run, where something occurs either uncertainty-wise or non-credible contingency-wise that we wouldn't have reserves for, which could put the CAISO BAA in a supply deficiency when you include those LPT exports in the RTPD6 run. Those would be curtailable eventually, but you're highlighting that they just don't get picked up as needing curtailment in that RPTD run immediately prior to the final RSE.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is we've gone to the trouble to label these as firm provisional, right? So we think that they are less supportable than load. And yet when we come into the how much do you have to pay, we're saying that we're going to support them with, potentially, incredibly high scarcity prices. And I would be okay with that if we're really just talking about emergency transfers. We're 100 megawatts short. We pay for 100 megawatts. But what you're proposing here really is scarcity pricing for the entire FMM and the entire RTD, which seems problematic on top of the whole load conformance issue that we have in FMM, right? We've already identified that results in potentially a large payment. This potentially results in even larger payment, right?
On the latter comment, I would agree only to the extent that something happens in between when they're cleared out of HASP and that final RTP6 that's run immediately prior. I think if you want to start talking about load bias, that's a different, bigger question. But I actually think we're not proposing to change anything for in this test.
Right, but I'm also saying that what we're proposing in the next slide is not emergency assistance. It's really scarcity pricing for the FMM and RTD. And we're proposing to do that, including the LPT exports that we've already labeled for and provisional. So that's my point.
And this is Scott. I want to jump in. It's also possible there are other reasons we could fail when we shouldn't. We got the demand curve in HASP, and there's no demand curve. And, if we put the uncertainty in, there's no demand curve in the resource sufficiency test. So, we could clear some price-taking exports by going short on FlexiRamp internal to the CAISO and not have the full required for the uncertainty test and then fail. There's a number of, gaps between this that could cause us to fail inadvertently. But if we saw that we failed the test at T-55, couldn't the operators then cut these transactions to get us back to passing?
I think they may be able to. I don't think we have system operations on the phone. My gut feeling is that they would probably wait and see how stuff develops in the intervening minutes, because they would probably try to wait to within the hour to see if uncertainty materialized or what occurred before curtailing these, because I think they do want to try to honor the LPTs as much as possible. If you curtail them that far out, then I don't think that's in spirit with that, but I would defer to them, and I don't think we have anyone from that team on the call, unfortunately.
But I'm raising the question of if they see in the T-55 run that the CAISO is going to fail the RSC test, and they know we've got these LPP exports, shouldn't they cut them right there between T-55 and T-40? So anyway, that's my thought about this. It would be better to think about that before they have to decide in real time.
Yeah, and I think what you're proposing then is we would extend the scheduling priorities in the market itself, at least, to that RTTD6 run, because then why are they, if the objective is really to have them automatically curtailed following the HASP, then that would be one way to do that. But then I guess you do lose control, and they could get curtailed even if you don't follow the RSC. So it's, now I'm thinking through implementation kind of out loud on an MSC call, and I think trying to sequence the RTBS results to what the market scheduling priorities could be might be more complicated, and we might get, and might be worthwhile to pursue, but then this gets back to the what's implementable by next summer question, and that's a lot of additional complexity.
I mean, it is an interesting paradigm here because we're talking about, emergency energy purchases happening at the same time as lots of exports. And yeah, if the LPT is not part of the RSC, at least it's not causing the failure. But yes, failures could still happen while you simultaneously have these. Maybe this is part of the next discussion, but I'm also curious what the price of those exports would look like if there is an import into CAISO at the penalty, at the emergency energy penalty. What would an export be priced at? Maybe that's a question for the next topic. But if it is going to be at the penalty price as well, then then it's possible the recipient might not want it either.
If the penalty prices did get indexed up by the assistance energy transfer, it would definitely introduce an additional drawback to just being a self-scheduled export out of the CAISO DAA for kind of last-minute supply. Okay, well, I think we could, are you comfortable moving to the next slide, Jim?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is really the second large topic that we wanted to get your opinion on and have you weigh in on, and it's the idea to create almost a new type of transfer. We're calling it assistance energy transfers that would occur between WEIM BAAs following the failure of the RESC by one BAA. The principle here is that the market is much better able to uncover residual supply or optimally use it as well as the existing transmission than can be done through the bilateral emergency energy paradigm. So we want to try to utilize the market to do this to the greatest extent possible without kind of undermining forward procurement incentives. So the proposal that we've come up with is to allow transfers into the deficient BAA at a hurdle rate that's assigned at an additional cost. So right now, I'm not sure if you recall or not, but we have these de minimis transfer costs that we apply to all EIM transfers to arrive at an optimal solution. They're like 1/10 of a cent or something like that. This was existing functionality that we could apply a larger transfer cost on to effectively create a hurdle rate to price these transfers into the deficient BAA. We do propose for this to be electable criteria through the master file. We heard some feedback, actually a lot of feedback, that entities kind of want to more dynamically be able to elect to get this type of assistance or not. To me, that's a little bit of a two-sided sword. I think that if you want to leverage the WEIM to increase your reliability, you probably should. That shouldn't be a one-off decision that you're trying to figure out if the WEIM or external bilateral emergency assistance is a better option. The flip side of that is the RSC can fail for any reasons, and this does create potentially high-cost transfers into a deficient BAA for more anomalous failures that might not indicate true undersupply conditions. So that's a fair point. The other way that we've kind of envisioned this, and I think we go into it more in the next slide, talking about how it would work from a pricing perspective, is that we will look to ensure that, we're automatically going there. We would look to add either $1,000 or $2,000 transfer cost on the transfer into the deficient BAA. What this does is this should ensure that the capacity within that deficient BAA, as well as the ABC that may be withheld, is utilized by that BAA. So all the supply that they have gets utilized, then the resulting EIM transfers that are priced that high really would be reflective of undersupply and transfers that are needed to cure an undersupply condition. I'd like to stop there and see if you have any questions kind of on the general concept before we get into more details.
Okay, just remind me, the master file, I should think of that as like a quarterly or biannual sort of updated thing. It's definitely not a today looks bad, I'm going to change my master file kind of thing, right?
I think it's 3 to 5 days, although please don't quote me on that. It might be up to a week, and you can do it going forward. So if next week you saw, okay, on 9/24, I'm projecting like real hot loads, this might be something I'm interested in, I think they'd have the ability to say, to switch it to elect for this assistance for stress conditions. What it does is prevent like a BAA from hourly toggling this, calling around and saying, hey, can you sell me this bilaterally? Oh, no, you can't, then I'll use the WEIM.
Okay, yeah, and hopefully we get a chance to discuss maybe a trigger that's somehow linked to the hard to define, admittedly, definition of scarcity might accomplish the same thing, but without the sort of awkward toggling of status, perhaps.
Agreed.
Sorry, I didn't catch.
No, I just said I agree. I think to the extent we can do that, that's a better approach than kind of the rough justice way we have this proposed for implementation right now.
Okay, yeah. So my other questions had to do more with kind of the details of this implementation, which kind of were along the lines of some of the things Michelle was asking about, but also um, just I was the examples in the draft final proposal. I think some stakeholders pointed this out too. Are sort of unclear as to what happens to the prices in the exporting area when the trigger is happening. I sort of envisioned it's going to move up, obviously, the bid stack in the exporting region because you're exporting more energy. But could it trigger scarcity in the exporting region, for example, if it wasn't quite to scarcity yet, it had some, exportable energy, but maybe not, everything that the importing region would want. And I guess I hadn't quite. And then, getting back to the discussion of the Michelle scenario, what are the prices? What would the prices look like if there was an export from an area that was itself deficient? And which seems kind of like not an ideal scenario. And it seems like there should be a way to kind of optimize for that, but I maybe get back to the implementation issues. So let's just start with the exporting triggering scarcity question, I guess.
Yeah. So your understanding of this is how we envision it working in implementation. Effectively, the exporting footprint who's supporting this transfer would just clear that many megawatts higher up on that bid stack for the rest of the footprint, and that's how the prices would be set. To the extent that did trigger the footprint having some very, very expensive prices, your situation is realistic. If you had a bunch of bids for $200 generators, but you went 1 megawatt over that to support an assistance energy transfer and it went to 500, then the LMP would be $500 external or the marginal energy cost would be reflective of that last unit needed to support the assistance energy transfer.
Mm-hmm. I guess I was thinking even the extreme of if you got into a PBC sort of situation or some other, relaxation kind of thing, that whether that could happen or because you would then have equal sort of emergency on both sides of this, whether it wouldn't go that far.
So I think just given the current footprint of the WEIM, it's a little bit unlikely to happen, but to the extent that it can, we do have a constraint right now that essentially doesn't let any BAA have its PVC relaxed if it has an EDAM export going out of it, or if it's exercised ABC. So to the extent that this required incremental upwards EIM exports from one BAA into another, it would never actually set administrative penalty prices in the exporting BAA because it wouldn't relax the undergen surplus variable to support the transfer. But you could get very, very high prices immediately up to or near that administrative penalty price.
And a couple stakeholders sort of asked about like whether there would be the option to opt out as an exporter as well as, you've got the toggle from the importing perspective. But if there are concerns about what this might do to prices in the exporting area, is that, bids also accomplish that sort of thing, but, different parties within a given BAA may have different perspectives about that.
Yeah, I think what you just pointed out is exactly right. Like entities can control the way that their generation is used in their more expensive generation by just not making it available to the WEIM. I kind of view this, if you take it out of a pure emergency and prices are really tight, prices are going to rise everywhere because conditions are really tight, and that kind of is what it is. I view the assistance energy transfer as kind of an extension of that principle of supplies made available. It's going to clear where it clears to meet demand. This is just, it's setting a fairly high administrative price basically in the deficient BAA, but everywhere else it's the same principle that your supply could have cleared higher up your bid stack and gotten you closer to what would be scarcity pricing for your WEA and BAA, just like it would if you didn't have assistance energy transfers. Maybe you're just exporting to a BAA that has really, really high prices and is near the cap, and you're just clearing more supply in your BAA to support those EAM transfers.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very different situation for the CAISO, where you would have a bunch of different entities on the supply side and on the demand side, and there isn't the option of pulling your generation out of the EIM.
Yeah, but that's true. But that's true. But right now, with kind of the real-time must-offer obligation, it's kind of already there for real-time use anyway. It doesn't. I guess it could clear additional export transfers, which might clear higher up the bid stack for those generators than the CAISO BAA.
Yeah, and I mean, if there is regional scarcity, then this is all sort of the appropriate prices. I guess it's sort of this concern again that if there's a trigger for some technical or random aspect of the evaluation, that somehow you could propagate scarcity prices in an unintentional way. And, I guess part of the whole point of the RSE, it seemed like, is for an entity that is worried about scarcity to not have a shortfall in another neighboring BAA kind of propagate backwards into their area and trigger scarcity in their area just because somebody else failed the RSE in a legitimately scarce situation. And I took that as the spirit of sort of wanting to opt out of the export option, but it does.
The scarcity is there, Jim. I mean, the RSC just makes people fail. The scarcity is going to be you don't have enough supply, and that's not changed by this. That the fact that they need the energy and
fair enough, but you could end up with
EIM is we're not carving it up with one price for Larry and another price for Scott, and then we have to decide like which electrons go to which balancing area. The cheap ones went to Scott and the expensive ones went to Jim.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess I'm thinking relative to the current situation, you could end up exporting more of your energy to the insufficient BAA, though, than under the current rule where we're just sort of freezing their transfers.
Right, but that's because they're about to shed load. So I mean, that's the whole point. Is we want to help people out by exporting to people that are so desperate they're going to shed load. I don't see that as a negative. And why would you want to? What's the downside as long as the price is going to be appropriate and you offered the supply? I mean, it could, in these circumstances, we could see this if the FlexiRamp product gets working, better as you're suggesting there. That could when we get tight, we're going to start cutting into FlexiRamp, and that'll start driving up the price. But if we're not tight, it won't. But if this is being triggered in tight conditions, yeah, it'll start driving up the price, and the people who have supply will get paid more than if we let the other balancing area go black or make them shed load.
Well, and that kind of dips into another topic that I haven't touched on yet, which would be the way that we would settle this. So we're looking to pay basically the marginal energy cost to the generators external who are supporting this transfer, but then all this extra revenue gets collected basically as a separate congestion component across all of the ties into the deficient BAA, and then we're going to allocate that out pro-rated to net EDM exporters, and then hopefully that additional revenue, to the extent that any of their members were disadvantaged by clearing higher up, that they would be able to have discretion on a BAA by BAA basis to figure out how to allocate out that additional revenue. Which I know I jumped ahead a little bit, but I thought it was pertinent.
Sure. Yeah, I'm still trying to process kind of the Michelle scenario, and maybe you answered this, but if, let's say, the CAISO is in a failure interval, and so and they've opted for the energy. By the way, has there been a discussion about which option the CAISO would take? I assume they would take the energy assistance option.
Well, I thought so too, and that's what we proposed, but I think with the feedback we've received to the latest iteration of the proposal from the internal IOUs, 6 cities, I think PUC, I think we would propose to default it as no, and then have further discussions to parties internal to the CAISO BAA about what it would take to make them more comfortable getting to yes.
Yeah, I did, it is interesting. There's this odd paradigm where the decision is at the BAA level, and a lot of stakeholders did say, hey, wait a second, what if we don't want to do it? And the BAA decides it. So anyways, but let's say maybe this couldn't happen then. I guess the CAISO's transfers it. But let's say they did opt for the energy assistance pricing, and there was LPT exports. Would those exports then also carry that penalty price? So,
they should, yeah, because they're not going to be settled till the FMM, right? You get your half schedule, which is your award, but then the price gets pulled out of the FMM
so
run.
They get the FMM price, but even if the receiving BAA is not in penalty, I guess if the receiving BAA was in penalty as well, would it actually be double penalty then?
The receiving BAA was in penalty. So both in the situation,
say CAISO fails and they're exporting LPT to another area that also failed.
I think that they would get it if I don't think so, because the price for the transfer out of the CAISO, say it's $500, and say the generation in the past group is $500, you have the $1,000 transfer into the CAISO. And then, so that's a $1,500 export out, which you'd apply a $1,000 transfer cost to. So all of a sudden it's $20. So the question you're asking is, does that become a cost verified bid above $2,000?
No, actually,
I need to give that.
You're ahead of me even. I was just asking mechanically if the penalty gets applied twice, if it's sort of a transaction out of CAISO, which is already in penalty, into another area that would also be receiving emergency energy. Whether this sort of they're paying $1,500 because that's a CAISO's cost, so that's appropriate. But are they also paying the additional $1,000 transfer penalty? And I'm assuming not $2,000 under the same.
Hey, this is Brad. We need to confirm the answer to that question, because I think it won't affect the exports price, because it's just like when a tie, it's similar to when a tie is congested in the import direction,
Oh, really? Because it'd be like, so in fact, the price might be lower if the RSE fails on the receiving end, or because that would be the analogy to the transmission congestion.
Yeah, I
think so, but I'm not sure. We should confirm it.
Yeah, we'll take this back and confirm and get back to you.
Okay, well, so just a few details that I think getting fleshed out would be helpful, but overall, I mean, the idea of having a emergency energy option at some kind of scarcity-ish price makes a lot of sense. As with the LPT thing, trying to maybe differentiate true scarcity conditions to other modes, and we pointed out, like in the draft final proposal, there's even a footnote discussing a hypothetical where the price is minus 100 something in the exporting area, and how that could lead the price. And it just struck me as, wait, you're going to put a $1,000 tax on an export from an area that has negative energy. That just sort of seems like not something you'd want to be doing. And so having some mechanism that would, either gradate this penalty by something like the SMEC or some other measure of how scarce energy might be, or maybe by the degree of the shortfall, although those are really two separate concepts. One is sort of how short the whole system is, one is sort of how guilty the receiving BAA that's failing is. But both of those sort of moderations seem like they would help to not kill off transactions during periods where there's sort of just a random failure, which seems like a real concern, although I'm still trying to get a better sense of how many of these failures are happening during, weeks like last week versus sort of, periods where there's actually, ample energy to export in a lot of BAAs, but one BAA fails for an uncertainty test fluctuation or some other reason. But
so a couple
mm-hmm.
a couple answers, Jim. On the first point you made, you're right. The stuff gets really, really odd when you start working in negative prices, and that's actually, I'm not sure if you recall, but in the first iteration of this proposal, we tried to introduce a concept where you would actually relax the export failure constraint for oversupply conditions, kind of the same principle of everybody wins. But then you start trying to figure out how to price a transfer cost on a negative or an export cost on a negative price. And it's basically an order of magnitude more complicated than like whatever is kind of a non-intuitive concept of negative pricing. So to us, it made sense to pull that out of this, and we will look to do that at a future date, but give that more time for discussion, because I think exactly to the point you're bringing up, it does get complicated when you start having negative prices.
Yeah, but I mean, just something like having a $500 or $750 trigger from the SMEC that would, the penalty would be $100 maybe if SMEC is below some level and $1,000 if it's above, or something like that. That just tries to distinguish.
That's the other thing I've struggled with this, because we do see like spurious failures during non-stress system conditions when no BAA is fit, like in April or in May when temperatures are a little bit warm but nothing crazy and most everything's back from winter outage and ready to go for the summer. You wouldn't expect to see failures. We do see failures, but I've always kind of rationalized that as that's failures because BAAs aren't I don't think that's because BAAs don't have the capacity. It's because they're not participating with all of their capacity during those non-stress conditions for whatever reasons they want to. But I don't know if that's, to me, it's not quite the same. There is a risk of spurious failure, but they do have some control over that risk by what's made available to the test.
Okay. So, for example, the CAISO's never failed when prices are low?
I don't know if it's never failed. I'm sure we can find examples where it's failed, but I would think it's probably when it's failed is due to kind of large quantities of uncertainty, maybe in the flex ramp test, or we got a weird dispatch or something. I think it can happen, but I don't think it would be as regular because the CAISO tends to participate more robustly with all its supply.
Yeah. Although, as Scott pointed out, it kind of depends on where the flexibility test goes, where the uncertainty component, if it comes back into the capacity test goes. And okay, well, those are, I guess the question is whether there's a technical reason why you couldn't have like a penalty that is linked to some market solution based, either I keep coming up with a SMEC, but maybe there's a better, some better trigger. It sounds like you're more like sort of in the camp of, well, we don't really think that a failure during a non-scarcity period is really that common or likely to be that common once people sort of focus on passing the RSE more.
I think that's a fair point. I wouldn't say we're not worried about it. I think what you're positing of having some trigger is probably a better approach. I just think back to, I hate to bring up system market power, which was, I know, everybody's favorite initiative, but we pitched 100 megawatts as a trigger for when we'd run the 3PS, right? And then we got a bazillion different comments that's great, that's not great, maybe 100 megawatts for your BAA, that's not scarcity in my BAA. And I kind of envision that same thing happening here, at which point we're not getting anything in place by next summer.
Yeah, and I mean, there are some potential complications just in terms of if it's a price trigger, maybe there's some odd bidding incentive feedbacks that happen if, you can sort of somehow, maybe you want this to kick up to $1,000 or you don't want it to, and that might affect bidding behavior in ways that I haven't fully processed, I suppose.
And even if it's like an RC-based trigger like an EEA, then kind of always a little reticent to involve kind of reliability coordinator functions and market functions, but then we do have multiple RCs in the Western interconnection, so you theoretically could get into situations where you have different RCs declare who, while EAA should be the same for everybody, may view them slightly differently, and it's just more complication, which I think is solvable, but takes more time to solve.
Another approach that would be to say if the FlexiRamp price is 0, then we don't apply this big penalty. But of course, that requires that we fix the FlexiRamp problem. So that's not all.
Yeah.
But that's why
Scott, you managed to take this back to FlexiRamp.
Yeah.
Right. I know. It's like it constrains our options because that would say we're drowning in ramp. We don't want you to put another thermal unit online. Please don't. And I think that would be consistent with environmental goals and rationalize this. But I understand that that's not the priority for next summer, but we ought to have it as a priority maybe for looking at what is causing these failures and maybe making it for a summer or two down the road.
Yeah, and the other thing to be transparent about is obviously the events of this recent heat wave will be really closely examined, and we're not able to say at this time exactly what we're going to find regarding how the RSU is performing accuracy-wise, but I think there is the potential for future enhancements based off kind of where this initiative ends and what it's able to accomplish for next summer, what we think we want going forward, as well as additional things that can pop up that we're not even aware of yet. RSU's kind of turned into an evergreen topic for enhancements, it seems.
I have one clarifying question about something you say on page 9, where you say revenue is collected from meter demand as the proposed formulation embeds the cost within the LMP. Now, those are contradictory to me because I think if it's embedded within the FMM LMP, it'll only be collected from the people that are short relative to their day market positions. And it won't be collected from meter demand, and it wouldn't be collected from day-ahead exports, but it would be collected from FMM exports. So what did you mean?
It should be collected on the total quantity of real-time and balanced energy, basically, right? Because the day-ahead should provide that hedge against that real-time price. So that's how I envision it working. Brad, is that kind of what you thought? Did I get the words right on this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Scott. I couldn't hear your whole statement. What were you saying is inconsistent in what we said?
Well, the way the wording on page 9 says it's collected from meter demand, it almost sounds like that's an uplift charge that will be allocated to all real-time meter demand. And maybe that's what had some of the California load-serving entities upset, is that they were going to get hit with this when, in fact, they were covered. But it sounds like you intended only to flow to the people who do not cover their positions in the day-ahead market. And that also means it'll flow to the real-time exporters that Michelle was talking about, that they'd have to pay the high price.
Yeah, that was on page 9, you said?
Yeah, the first bullet.
Okay. We can look at that.
I just wanted to quick add to Jim's comments about making the penalty dependent on what the prices are and perhaps eliminating if it's negative, or making it dependent on whether there's scarcity of FlexiRamp. It does present problems to do that within an optimization problem. If, on the other hand, you did that based on like the market power run or some other run before the final pricing run, then it's possible. But otherwise, you have to start sticking more integer variables in there and test. It can be quite a bit messy to make pricing dependent on decisions within the model. Now, on the other hand, having some sort of buffer or demand kind of, a softer constraint if the violation isn't too much, that certainly is possible. You could have a smaller penalty for de minimis violations, whatever that is. But I understand what you're saying, Danny, about figuring out what de minimis would mean would push this off beyond this coming summer.
Well, just remember, Ben, that the RSC test occurs before the pricing runs. So you wouldn't be solving those simultaneously. You'd be finding out that the people failed, and then...
Right, but to find out whether our LMP is
the
negative...
price at that point. You know what the price was in the HASP.
Yeah, I think...
The HASP price was zero.
Right. If we're looking for just a ballpark sort of measure of, we're getting tight, a HASP that's $500 or more or something,
Okay, so basically
above zero if you want to take
market. Yeah, so if there's a trigger is defined before you do the market run, rather than making a function of the price in the market, some variable in the market run. Yeah, that's certainly possible. And lots of.
I guess we could even use the same trigger that we're using for the $1,000, $2,000, although that's already a trigger. And it wasn't really thought of as a scarcity trigger either. But to the extent bilateral markets are sort of picking up scarcity conditions, it can kind of play that role.
I'm not thinking of scarcity conditions. I'm thinking of distinguishing it from we're drowning in intermittence. We don't want to commit another thermal unit condition. And that's what we don't want to have failures when that would cause people to commit another thermal unit and back down wind, which is on the margin. I think it's different. Once we get into positive flexi ramp prices, I think the people should be committing. But my thought is when we have zero flexi ramp prices,
okay,
we want another thermal unit to be put online.
I figure if the price in one BA is $250 and it's $100 in another BA and there's ample capacity sort of floating around on the 100 side, it's not clear that there's a need to kill off that $150 trade.
Mm-hmm. I do see that Michelle is on the phone line. Operator, can you invite Michelle to ask her question or make her comment?
This is Michelle from the PC. So what about this notion that the LPT exports are not included in the RSE? So, but for some other reason we fail. But then when you run the FMM, you include those LPTs and they push you into the hurdle rate. So absent those LPTs, we wouldn't have to go into that hurdle rate, but with them we do.
So you're saying yeah.
Go ahead, Dave.
No, I'm trying to follow the sequence of this.
Right.
And maybe I'm going to ask the same question to you.
Because the LPTs couldn't cause the failure because they're not part of the test anymore.
Right, I got that. But let's say the failure is because of
or some other reason.
Yeah, some other reason. So just bear with me that there's an RSE failure and we're on the edge and it's a 10 megawatt failure. And then we run the FMM and we include the 3,000 megawatts of LPT exports that we would otherwise have cut. But it
right. So the question becomes, is there a way to cut those rather than have to, or is that even the right answer? But let's just say, because I think under that scenario, basically those exports would cost $1,000 more, just like everything coming into the CAISO would. And it would only be imbalanced energy in the CAISO that would have to pay that scarcity price as well.
But absent those, maybe there would be no imbalance, right? So there would be no exports.
I think anybody within the CAISO who's taking an imbalance only but for the LPTs is in fact the exporter of that energy then, aren't they?
So doesn't it include the entire FMM market? So It's not just the incremental portion. It will clear the entire FMM market, right?
Well, anybody who's buying energy out of FMM would pay that price, yes.
Right. And we only got that to that price because of the LPT exports, right? Because you put them in the bid stack.
Yeah, so then it becomes like, well, you know, how, what do we think about those people who are internal to the CAISO buying out of the FMM? Is it unfair to charge them that high price? Or is that just sort of, we're in regional scarcity, there's this other area that really, you know, has to pay a lot for energy, and so energy is very dear in this 15-minute interval.
So because of the exports, we should have to pay $2,000 or $4,000?
Well, again, if they bought it in the day-ahead market, they wouldn't be paying that. It's just their imbalance that they would be paying.
Right, but
I'm still struggling with this premise. How are we failing with, if we're not including real-time exports? We're only including exports in the test that we can support, right?
Right. Well, no, but I guess the idea is we run HASP, and a bunch of LPT gets brought in, and then after HASP, something happens that causes one of the intervals to fail.
Yeah.
The RFC.
The wind forecast comes in way below, something else happens.
And this is the gap we identified earlier.
I guess I'm
exactly.
Just make sure, like it's that time between when HASP is run and RTPD6 is run.
Okay, but really my more fundamental point is, why do we access emergency energy when we have LPTs to cut? Why?
Yeah, instead of bringing in that 10 megawatts in the 15-minute market at emergency prices, shouldn't we just cut our exports instead?
Yes.
And is that functionally, yeah, so I guess there's two sides of this. Is that the desired policy, and then is it technically possible?
Well, when you guys talked about emergency energy, I was really thinking about emergency energy.
Yeah,
like there's somebody
absolutely.
that can provide it. It wasn't that we're going to clear the entire FMM and RTD at, prices we've never talked about before.
Well, I think so. There's two sides. There's kind of should we support exports if it causes us to trigger into emergency conditions, and I think the whole idea of being an exporter under an emergency is very odd.
Well, and also just think about that. We didn't include it in the RFC, right?
Yeah. No, I agree. It could happen. And I just don't think it was the paradigm that sort of was front of mind when people were thinking about emergency energy. I mean, but also, anybody who's buying out of the real-time market when we're really close to these, it's a question of, yes, they're probably paying close to $1,000 anyways, but should they have to pay that extra $1,000 just because of the exports?
But the two conditions have to be met. You have to fail the RSC and go short, right?
But you can go short because of the exports, right? Because you're supporting.
You can go short to the only situation I can think of, Michelle, is you are clearing exports due to an import that essentially between the HASP and RTPD6 has, say, a fire under COI, which results in the CAISO having a supply shortfall greater than its contingency reserves. Then in RTPD6, it hasn't kind of curtailed those exports yet like it would actually in real time, and then it fails. But that's kind of functionally the situation and the problem we're trying to solve.
Or wind forecasts. So I'm just saying that it's not just that we're asking to pay the high prices for the transfer. We're asking to clear the market at that, which seems fundamentally different. And not only that, we're including LPTs. Like maybe you guys could look at the August events and see how many LPTs we were clearing at the same time we were in an EEA2. I mean, that would be a great example, or EEA3 or an EEA1. And if you are clearing those LPTs, then why should we be paying emergency assistance? I'm just really struggling with that.
I think the answer would be from like the CAISO thinking right now is that when we cleared those LPTs, we thought we would be able to support them, and we were trying to stand behind that supply because our market systems thought we could support them, and we would look to do so.
Right, throwing
And
us.
I think what I'm hearing is you just disagree with that premise and think that they should be curtailed prior, right?
I guess I'm asking, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying, one, we're not including it in the RSE because we assume we can cut it. We've said that we will cut it. We get to the situation where we need to get emergency energy and we're unwilling to cut it. And we're willing to send us our entire, not just for the incremental, we're going to send the entire system into scarcity conditions for which we are going to have to pay because we're not vertically integrated. Right?
I guess to me, it's still a really narrow window of when this happens because the market's not going to clear large volumes of LPTs if the CAISO's not failing the RSE because we're only including day ahead LPTs, which through the HASP or the RUC process we know we can support. We're not including any real-time LPTs.
So maybe
really
could tell us whether we were supporting LPTs during the EEA2s.
Well, I mean, I did ask, I think, a while ago whether we curtailed any LPTs, and he said we did curtail some, but I took that to mean we did not curtail all. Yeah, and I didn't know if they're ready to provide any more details, but that would be good to know, I agree. But I do think there is a sort of philosophical issue here, too, about how we feel about domestic load that is short, that is, taking an imbalance for themselves. I think you agree, Michelle, that that the energy that is produced inside CAISO that gets exported out, that should be priced expensively. In other words, if we're paying emergency energy just for the export, that the export should have to pay that emergency energy price.
I guess it depends on how they allocate it. If they allocate it, yeah, I mean, I get that.
It sounds like your issue is with the sort of bystander load there that would also be short in the 15-minute market because they're buying out of the 15-minute market.
Sure.
But if not for the emergency assistance trigger, would be paying like a maximum of 1,000, and now they'd be paying double that.
Or maybe
Jim, this is Brad. I'm thinking about it more. The more I think about it, I think I was wrong when I said that the export price wouldn't increase. I think it would because it's not a hard constraint. And that's the cost of the energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a penalty.
And then also think about this: if we don't fix the FRP, we're going to be doing imbalance in the FMM, right? And I call from the last thing that you said, the last MSC opinion. Let's see. In summary, the basic point is load conformance adjustments are not motivated by a desire to correct load forecast. In fact, the power scheduled in FMM as a result of load conformance adjustments generally does not flow in RTD. There is therefore no leaning on the rest of the system as a result of using load conformance adjustments in HASP and RTD. Rather, the California load buys at high prices in the FMM and sells back in RTD. This should be a concern to CAISO ratepayers, but it benefits non-CAISO EIM entities who export power to the CAISO in the FMM. Aren't we going to, if we don't fix FlexiRamp, aren't we going to be making this worse with our new adjustment, which includes $1,000 or $2,000 adders?
Yeah, there's a lot of this that's wrapped up in FlexiRamp, Michelle. And as I was saying earlier, there's a problem of, failing the sufficiency test, not because of exports, because we don't model FlexiRamp and HASP. So we got we got a whole bunch of things. We can't move one direction or another without causing a problem until we fix FlexiRamp.
Right. And
I was running that scenario earlier that suppose we fail the RSC, not because of the exports, but because HASP didn't clear enough capacity to pass the uncertainty test. I think we should look at those, those T-minus 55 results, and why shouldn't we cut the exports for T-minus 40 if there's what puts us over the edge? But it'd be better not to have the bad results in the first place.
Okay. Thanks. I mean, it also seems like if the first thing we should do is fix FlexiRamp in scarcity pricing, that's what we should do, because this just seems like a backdoor way to do scarcity pricing as opposed to energy assistance. So that's just me. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. And I would note for everybody, we are working on fixing FlexiRamp. It's filed at FERC right now. We're awaiting a decision, and I think to the extent that we get tariff authority, we'd look to implement it later this fall. So.
Are there any other questions in the queue?
Yes. Next person. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead. Bonnie, do you still have a question?
I do, yeah. I'm sorry. The operator's voice broke up a little bit when she said my name, so I wasn't sure it was me or somebody else. Anyway, this is Bonnie Blair. I represent the Six Cities group. We were one of the folks that raised the question about what happens to exports, whether they're subject to the administrative penalty. I also have a question about when is the administrative penalty or not the administrative penalty? When is the price penalty triggered? In other words, let's say there's a 25 megawatt RSE failure. If you're opted into the assistance energy program, you potentially trigger 25 megawatts of assistance energy, but maybe when it comes down to the actual interval, you know, the load is a little bit lower or the solar output's a little bit higher, and the assistant energy doesn't actually flow. When does the assistance energy price impact kick in? Does it only kick in if there's at least 1 megawatt hour of assistance energy that flows? Or does it somehow kick in when you fail the RSE and you're opted in for assistance energy?
It should, this is Danny with the ISO, Bonnie, it should trigger when you fail the RSC, and then when you get to the actually financial binding intervals, need those transfers to cure your forecasted amount.
So if it turns out
if you fail by 25 megawatts,
transfers,
yeah, if the market says you don't get a transfer, and it won't give you a transfer if there's not $1,000 benefit, in other words, if you don't really need it, then I think it won't schedule the transfer, and then the penalty price will not affect the price on the receiving end. But I think that's it. As of the market solution, if something happens in real time, I'm not sure. Like within a 5-minute interval, I'm not sure how that would.
What I was struggling to understand is whether there's any way either to luck out of being subject to the additional charge, or to somehow maneuver your way out of being subject to the additional charge by redispatching something or.
Yeah, I think if there's dispatchable resources, this is Jim, sorry, so I'm kind of guessing as well. But as my understanding is, if there's dispatchable resources on the receiving end as of the time you run the market, so you failed the RSE a little bit in advance, but now we're running it in real time, and there is some dispatchable resources at say $600, that it will take that and it'll just set the EIM transfer to 0. And then there won't be the $1,000 kicker on there. Is that right, Danny?
Yeah, that's right. And then I think to extend on that, Jim, if they're non-dispatchable resources to the extent that, say, the CAISO has some emergency procured supply, it really becomes a question of how quickly are those able to get incorporated into the load forecast? And then eventually, how quickly do they actually get utilized that is reflected on transfers?
Okay, and then one more question that kind of follows from what you just said, Danny. Kind of what is does the $1,000 penalty price, does that what's the minimum time period that applies? Is it the 15-minute interval? Is it an hour? Or is it
should be the 15-minute interval.
The 15
because
minutes.
the RSCs run every 15 minutes, so that's kind of the most granular time window that you can meet both conditions of being insufficient and having filled the RSC in.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
And so, okay, to follow up then, if let's say, okay, so you fail the RSC, so the $1,000 penalty is sort of in force for the next 15 minutes, for this 15 minutes. And then let's say you've got one RTD interval that zeroes out the EIM flows, but then another that might take some positive assistance energy. Would the $1,000 kicker apply only in the RTD interval that's taking the positive EIM transfer and not in the one that didn't?
It should apply. My understanding is it would apply in just the interval that had the EIM transfer, the import transfer to cure.
So if you can still hear me, that would be a 5 minute, right?
Yeah. And, that's part of the, that's part of the elegance of this approach is that it is actually sort of looking at the alternatives in the receiving BAA and basically exhausting all of those alternatives is the idea before you take the emergency energy, unless you've got an exporter with negative prices.
Yeah, and remember that you could fail if we have the uncertainty component in. You could fail because of the uncertainty component, and then not need any of the energy. DMM in their report pointed out there are lots of people that fail the test and then are exporters because they don't have that huge uncertainty. The uncertainty is a 1 in 40 probability. So there is a lot of potential to fail the RSC, but not need any imports.
Yeah, Robert, who I see in the queue, refers to this as the uncertainty lottery in the context of EDAM, but that's basically what it is.
All right. Well, Robert can respond to that now. You're up, Robert.
Thanks, Danny. I'm going to hit part of what I was going to say, but I wanted to ask a clarifying question to something you said earlier about CAISO in regards to using this emergency energy. And correct me if I'm wrong, you stated that you're still in discussion if you may use this or not.
Yeah, so I can answer this. I think we proposed in the most recent iteration to use this, but based off the feedback we've received from the parties who would be exposed to this, it seems like they want to better understand how it would work and kind of the sequencing with LPT exports and how some of the emergency supply, both through RDRR or potentially this other emergency supply that's being kind of procured outside of the CAISO, would be utilized in figuring out how, like basically sequencing where assistance energy transfers fit within how the CAISO works through stress system conditions.
Okay, that's really important because I'm going back to the question of the exports versus the emergency energy situation. So if CAISO does not opt in to use this emergency energy, then that scarcity pricing would not occur within that BA because the pricing only occurs within the region that is opted to purchase this emergency energy. That's a question, sorry.
Trying to think through that question.
Yeah, that seems right. There wouldn't be a penalty.
Yeah.
But
yeah, you would have just normal prices, right?
Yeah, although
if the CAISO went short, it'd be PVC.
Which, if the CAISO went short at PVC after HAS, that'd just be like any other condition, nothing related to any emergency or energy assistance, right? Which would have normal pricing like it currently does.
And so, yeah, it would more or less work like the current situation because let's say the CAISO fails, they would have their intertie flows frozen at the last passing interval level. And so that might cause some LPT exports to be curtailed if we're getting into a power balance constraint sort of situation, but it wouldn't cause them to be priced at 2,000 or whatever with the $1,000 kicker.
Yeah. And if CAISO decides to use this emergency energy, I would assume they would create some kind of procedural aspect to cut the LPTs prior to using that emergency energy, right?
Well, that's what the discussion with Michelle was about.
And I assume at that point, because they're hourly resources, you can't make that decision on the market because they are now past that hourly decision part in the market. So that would have to be an out-of-market action. And this is kind of getting back to Danny. This flag might be useful in real time.
The more granular toggling. Yeah, that's
Mm-hmm.
all said. The other thing I want to kind of advertise is I think this fall we are looking to try to figure out how to sequence all of the different emergency or near emergency type supply and manual actions the CAISO has to make sure that they're not undermining market prices and to figure out how this works best for the CAISO BAA. So I think it's really clear that at least go live through a proposal, the CAISO BAA probably isn't going to elect to do this. I think at the CAISO we think that this is a good idea. So it's figuring out where within that fleet of emergency type actions this fits that we still need to do as a collective BAA with our BAA members.
Well, thank you for the clarification. I appreciate it.
Hey, Robert, before you hang up, I just wanted to ask, I'm going to put you on the spot as representative stakeholder. I didn't really see in the comments, as I was reading this, I just kept worrying about this being a sort of near punitive tax for EIM transactions during sort of periods where there's just a uncertainty failure, but there isn't really a lot of scarcity going on. But I actually didn't really see any stakeholders articulate that concern, except maybe in the context of there being a desire to be able to elect which option to be under. So I do wonder whether I'm just sort of alone on this or whether this is something people have thought about and worried about.
But I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Bushnell, that kind of goes back to the toggling aspect because master file allocation is done for, say, a trade date, right? And you may go into a failure in earning 17 in the up direction, and it could purely be I meant to zig when I meant instead of zag from an operator action perspective. And at that point, I may not want that emergency energy because I know we have plenty of energy occurring. Now, 2 hours later, I have a generator that lost. The bilateral market's short. I can't buy anything. And I have a true emergency condition from a reliability perspective. At that point, I may choose to toggle to want that emergency energy. And so that's kind of the election to do that in real time has been something we support just because I review all our flex ramp sufficiency, and there are manual mistakes. There are inaccuracies in our calculations. There's inaccuracies in different forecasting aspects, and so not every situation is one that we may want to elect this emergency energy condition. And so that's kind of why we have been supportive of the real-time toggling aspect versus a larger time frame. But we're in full support of getting this in and then maybe adding things to it later, but we don't want to mess with the timeline all that much either.
Okay, so that's how you think about it, though, is like more close-in toggling would sort of solve that issue. Or, to me, it doesn't necessarily solve the issue because you could still have your ties frozen, and there could still be some pretty economically beneficial transactions that are not happening just because of the quantity freeze that maybe a $50 or $100 hurdle rate would still allow. So it still seems second best to like something that would somehow objectively identify conditions that are, well, I guess Scott's, more concerned with surplus renewable, but, I guess there's different sort of gradations of scarcity here.
I think the design does a good job of recognizing the level of scarcity because you're going to go through all your energy you have within your area. If that uncertainty shows up, if your load comes in higher, your renewables drop out faster than you expect, you also will start dispatching your ABC. So you will dispatch that additional energy into that circumstance. And then at that point is where you would use that emergency energy to get that last incremental value that could help support the reliability for your balancing authority.
Yeah, that's if you've elected the energy assistance and you're truly in scarcity. I agree. It works well, I mean, I understand that it's kind of an attractive solution for that circumstance. I'm more worried about the other circumstance where we're not actually into the emergency and we just kind of put $1,000 tax on any kind of EIM trades. But that's where the toggling would help. But
yeah, the toggling and then and actually going short, relaxing that transmission constraint and using your ABC.
I see. Danny, is there a strategic concern with allowing more? I haven't thought through how one might be able to use toggling in a way that's unintended, or is it more of a technical concern of just trying to process all of that information close in?
To me, it's a bit of both, Jim. I think that it is an additional integration step, which is going to be challenging. But then just from a policy standpoint, I can imagine a situation where a BAA operator is calling around and determining if any of its neighbors can sell them a block of power at a fixed price, which I think the CAISO would probably be represented as a self-schedule, or whatever bilateral price they're agreeing to for just that fixed quantity of energy. That may be more attractive than than having to price all of your real-time imbalance energy at this kind of administratively set transfer cost. So I do imagine a situation where BAAs would try to optimally utilize the WEIM for reliability only when they've exhausted their out-of-market options to try to find solutions.
Yeah, I could see there's also the attractiveness of the current policy is also very much linked to what what you'd be frozen at. So if you happen to have locked in a pretty big flow in your pass interval, then, okay, that looks pretty good for a while.
That's totally true. It makes those they're not gaming, but those kind of marketing opportunities a little bit, it does create some.
Okay, I don't see any more. Oh, no, Michelle's in the queue. Sorry, my window keeps scrolling up.
Yeah, Michelle, just one more question. Let's say that the operator does do a manual curtailment. Does that flow into the market, and does that reduce our need to go up the supply curve for those imports?
The broad answer is yes, it should, but the more nuanced answer is I think it depends when that curtailment occurs compared to when those intervals are actually being run.
So it's possible that we curtail them, but still we go into those higher prices because of the WEIM transfers?
We could curtail them, and then the question is how quickly does it get reflected in the NSI, which feeds into the RTPD runs or into the RTPD and RTD runs that are actually having the cost applied to.
And do we have any idea? Well, the timing. How much ahead of the time do you have to cut for it to flow in? Okay. Well, anyway, that's a separate question. And then I guess my other question is, if you do fail by 1 megawatt, it's not just that 1 megawatt has a hurdle rate. It's any import into the CAISO balancing authority then has a hurdle rate, right? So even though we might have had 3,000 megawatts of advisory EIM transfers that effectuated blah, 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 all of those EIM are now going to have that $1,000 hurdle rate, right?
She's asking, let's say you fail the RSE by 1 megawatt, and there are 3,000 megawatts of imports scheduled. or advisory imports in the EIM, then yeah, that's basically, or then that's saying that if actually we take those, or that there would be a penalty for all of those imports, not just the first megawatt.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So in other words, the penalty kicks in from megawatt 0 once the penalty's in effect.
Yeah.
It's only for the imports you take. So if you fail the RSC by 1 megawatt and the CAISO has an 800 megawatt uncertainty requirement, we wouldn't actually take any power till we ran through the 800 megawatts of unloaded capacity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Danny, how many more slides are there?
I think we've covered the material on the last 2 slides, and I know we're already over time and cutting into Gabe's time, so.
Yeah, I just want to,
yeah.
Ben, I'm going to interrupt Ben. No, I just wanted to do a curveball and just ask. So, you covered the things you are proposing to do. There are a few things you're proposing not to do, including, still not add any uncertainty to the capacity test. I think I asked this last time and I've just forgotten the answer. I don't know whether this has been seriously considered, but have you considered just a simple adder to the capacity test instead of all the, quantile regressions and what the right sample, just adding X% to net load and call that the uncertainty? And maybe you differentiate that by, time of day or something like that. But, sort of a more simple rule that just reflects that there is some uncertainty, but we're not going to try to get too fancy and scientific about it, at least until we've fleshed out how these regressions are working.
I know that Guillermo and George have given this more thought than me, so maybe they'll have something to add, but at least I've personally thought about this, and kind of where I've arrived is where you indicated that you'd have to maybe index it for time of day, but then I think in really hot conditions, you probably have less uncertainty because the wind's already at 0 and solar is really high and there's not a lot of clouds in California. So you'd almost have to then index it for different system conditions, at which point you're indexing it for time of day and system conditions, at which point it's no longer just a simple uncertainty adder. And what we have is tries to capture all those varying conditions. So long answer to say, considered it. I'm not sure it's a panacea for how much uncertainty should be tested for in this.
Mm-hmm. Remember, Jim, one of the problems was that the current method doesn't account for how much intermittent output there is. So people were getting uncertainty requirements that were way larger than their intermittent output. And that's nuts. And that's part what drove us to the more sophisticated modeling. So just putting on a percentage would take us back to what already caused problems.
Okay. Well, X% of load and Y% of intermittent. That's my next proposal. All right. We'll see how that quantile regression does.
Somehow it comes back to FRP one last time. So thank you all.
Okay, Danny. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're now going to go on to the next agenda item. And this is going to be, there we are. It's the first of 2 agenda items on storage. And this one is restrictions on the state of charge of storage resources if they're providing ancillary services to provide some assurance that they're able to actually be there if they are actually deployed for a certain period of time. And Gabe and Bill will be discussing this. And Bill, welcome. I think this might be the first MSC meeting that you joined us on.
Sure, but I've always been lurking in the background. So.
Yeah, that's right. And I assume that counsel is COUNSEL, right? You're an attorney?
That's correct, yeah. I'm not a group of advisors or something.
Great. Okay. Well, looking forward to your presentation.
Great. Hey, Ben. I think I'll be taking up the pen here initially, or the microphone, I guess. Oh, can you hear me?
Yep, you're there.
Oh, good. All right. And I'll also take credit for misspelling Bill's title. That was me. So I apologize for that, Bill. So let's get into the material. This is kind of an interesting one. You know, we have actually been working on this internally for, you know, a couple of months at this point. And, you know, this all sort of stemmed from a concern that was raised by DMM. You know, market monitoring was reviewing some data. They found some things that were of concern. They, you know, kind of escalated it to the ISO. We talked about it internally. We sort of, you know, wrapped our arms around what the problem was. We sort of, you know, escalated this internally, and then we started thinking about potential solutions and how we wanted to proceed. And ultimately, what we decided on was to escalate this even higher and take this to our Board of Governors, who approved the ISO taking next steps to file changes to our tariff. And the changes that we're filing, Bill's going to go through what the specifics are of the changes, and I'll kind of go through some of the background of what it was that was sort of flagged in the first place, and you know, why we took the action that we took. And, you know, frankly, this is, you know, again, very different than a normal stakeholder process where we normally start to think about an issue, socialize it with stakeholders, you know, then much later in the process be talking to the Market Surveillance Committee about it, and then even later in the process be taking this to our Board of Governors and eventually filing it FERC. So a little bit of a different order on this particular one. And the issue that we're considering here is related to a constraint that we have in our market called the ancillary service state of charge constraint. It's documented to some degree in our business practice manuals. So we do have some information out there on it, and it stems directly from a tariff requirement that we have in our tariff today. So let's start there. And the tariff requirement really says that all resources that are providing ancillary services must meet continuous energy requirements in the day-ahead and real-time market. Specifically, what are those requirements? If a resource is providing regulation or spinning reserves or non-spinning reserves, you basically have to be able to provide that service for at least a 1-hour period in the day-ahead market and at least a 30-minute period in the real-time market. So when we're thinking about storage resources, what we actually do is impose a constraint that these requirements are met. We've talked a little bit about this in the energy storage enhancements when we've been talking about, you know, sort of constraints that govern storage resources. Well, you know, this is one of them. And the specific constraint that would be applied to storage resources is that they have sufficient state of charge to be able to provide the level of service that's specified in the tariff. So, for example, if the resource clears for a regulation up award in the day-ahead market, you'd have to have at least 1 hour of state of charge for whatever that regulation up award is. You know, for example, if a resource is awarded 50 megawatts during one particular hour, that resource would have to hold at least or have at least 50 megawatt hours of state of charge during that hour in order to provide that service. Regulation down works a little bit differently than regulation up. It's basically a headroom that you have to have. So if you've got the same 50 megawatt award of regulation down in the day ahead market, you'd have to have at least 50 megawatt hours of state of charge, of headroom of state of charge. So you'd have to have no greater than your sort of maximum state of charge minus 50 megawatt hours in order to provide that level of service. In the real-time market, you're only providing 30 minutes of state of charge instead of an hour of state of charge. So you get the same 50 megawatt award instead of the 50 megawatt hour requirement. you're only thinking about a 25 megawatt hour requirement. Let's advance to the next slide, please. So I think, yeah, this kind of outlines what the state of charge formulation actually looks like in the real-time market. So basically what we're saying is, reading that top equation, your state of charge at any particular time has to be greater than or equal to your minimum state of charge. So for most resources, this might be 0 megawatt hours, plus 0.5 times any reg up award, plus 0.5 times any spinning award, plus 0.5 times any non-spinning award. So you basically have to have that threshold of, again, if you've got a 50 megawatt reg up award, you have to have at least 25 megawatt hours if your minimum stated charge for this particular time period is 0 megawatt hours. The second equation on this is similar, and it's just for the reg down awards, but it basically says that your state of charge at time t has to be less than or equal to the maximum state of charge. So if your max happens to be 100 megawatt hours, then you'd use that 100 megawatt hour value and you subtract off 0.5 times the regulation down award. Okay. So I think I've got one slide for examples, and then I might pause to take questions just on the basic premise of what we're thinking about for this constraint, and then I'll get into talking about the issues. So let's advance just to the next slide. Okay, perfect. So simple examples here. I just constructed this, for ease of numbers. And I think I've already kind of outlined what one example might look like. But you've got a plus or minus 100 megawatt resource. So, it can operate at up to 100 megawatts of output, put energy out onto the grid or discharge. It can charge at up to 100 megawatts. So that's the other extreme end. So you'd be getting market instructions of minus 100 megawatts. And then your state of charge range would be between 0 megawatt hours and 400 megawatt hours. So essentially I'm saying, well, this is a 4-hour duration battery. So similar to most of the storage resources that we have on our system today. So in this particular case, suppose the resource has a 50 megawatt award for regulation up. You've got to hold at least 25 megawatt hours of state of charge. And if your minimum state of charge is 0 megawatt hours, which we're assuming in this case. And then the second is, well, what if you've got a 100 megawatt award for regulation down? Instead of your, a minimum requirement, now you've got a maximum requirement. The maximum requirement in this particular case is 350 megawatt hours, or your absolute maximum state of charge 400 megawatt hours minus 0.5 times the 100, which obviously is 50 megawatt hours, giving you the 350. Okay, so let me pause there and see if there's any questions on the line about what this constraint is or does, or anything like that about the mechanics before we get into kind of the issue and what the next steps are.
Okay, I see Alva is first in queue.
Yes, thank you. This is Alva Skubota, PG&E. Just to clarify what you're saying here, this constraint is used in the market processes, and so the market dispatch will attempt this will drive the procurement of regulation essentially. But if there is no this will not actually drive dispatch in the market to resolve the constraint, or will it? And if so, how? Because what I've just to anecdotally have observed that this constraint, and I believe it's a very reasonable constraint, by the way, that it can be resolved operationally in ways that are very different from what might be a market sort of a self-schedule type of solution that you would do as soon as you saw a violation of the constraint, say in the 5-minute market. So how does this actually, in your mind, what is the definition for how this currently gets resolved in the market processes and operationally?
Yeah, I mean, I think to start with, in the day-ahead market, I think you're right. I don't think there's, we've talked a lot about in the Energy Storage Enhancements Initiative, which is sort of the second presentation that I've got queued up for today, about how state of charge is governed for storage resources today. And one of the key things that we flagged in that Energy Storage Enhancements Initiative is that, we don't include awards for regulation or other ancillary services and their impacts or potential impacts to state of charge in the day-ahead market. So for storage resources that receive a lot of regulation awards, we typically don't see these these kinds of constraints bind because the requirement's not that onerous, and as long as you meet it for 1 hour and you're not receiving any energy awards, you'll meet it for the next hour and the next hour. But that's not to say that, if the day-ahead optimization thinks it's optimal for a resource to be completely depleted after a particular hour, then because of this constraint, the resource would be precluded from receiving like regulation up awards in the successive hour, because it would say, oh, no, because your resource is fully depleted, I can't schedule you for regulation. I need to charge you up before I do that. And the market optimization is going to go through the math to do that, to say, is this the most efficient way to get that regulation, or can I get it from another resource for cheaper? So in practice, I don't think this probably doesn't play too big of a role, except perhaps
but
setting
in real time, what would be done with this in real time?
Yeah. In the real-time market, this is a lot different. And we often talk about, when we're talking about storage resources, how things are different in the real time compared to the day-ahead market, because the day-ahead market, you're really looking at sort of a holistic problem of, you've got your load shape, when it's optimal to charge, when it's optimal to discharge, you can make those decisions, just in the same way you can make those trade-offs between, is it more optimal to have some of my storage resources, or potentially a majority of my storage resources providing regulating services or not, and you're making the trade-off between all the other resources in the market that are bidding for that service. In the real-time market, what can happen is, let's take a resource that's providing reg up, for example. So I've got a day-ahead award for reg up. That award spans many hours. Maybe let's just say it spans the whole day. So you're getting a large reg up award all day. Obviously, if you're providing reg up interval after interval after interval, that's going to slowly deplete your state of charge of the battery. Once you hit that threshold, so in this example, let's suppose you're being awarded a 50 megawatt award for regulation up. Once you hit that 25 megawatt hour threshold, then the market, the RTB market, will actually send you energy awards on a 5-minute basis to ensure that you always have that 25 megawatt hour threshold of energy in your state of charge. So if, for example, one 5-minute interval, you have 24.5 megawatt hours, you're going to receive a dispatch instruction for energy in the next 5-minute interval to get you charged back up to that 25 megawatt hour threshold. And again, in the next 5-minute interval, maybe if you're regulating again, you might actually be below that, and you continue to see these instructions to charge the resource.
So you'd agree that actually those instructions might not successfully address the constraint because of the fact that you're still on regulation. The market would dispatch you, and it might not actually correct for the constraint.
So the constraint will ensure that the state of charge is there, and it will ensure that the resource is able to continue to provide the regulating service. The caveat is it will do that as long as there's economic bids in the market. If there are no bids, let's say the resource is providing reg up and reg down, or it's just providing reg up and there's no bids to charge the resource, then it doesn't matter that the constraint's there, because the resource is unable to receive energy awards.
Right, but even if you have the bids, it's possible that the market solution will attempt to get you to a point where you can provide the regulation, but because of the fact that you're still on regulation, it may not address the constraint.
Yeah, you could perpetually be in the state where you're just hovering at this 25 megawatt hour.
Right, because the solution, because the market solution is still not going to see the regulation energy
Correct.
that's being used in the next 5 minutes. It's just going to continue to give you awards to attempt to. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And on a 5-minute basis, if you're already at 25 megawatt hours, it's not going to be possible to completely deplete the battery. So these energy awards will kind of continue to keep the battery relevant for that regulation award. But yeah, you're always going to kind of be hovering right at that 25 megawatt hour threshold.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. That's right on point, Elba.
Hi, this is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hey, Kathleen.
Hey, that was helpful. Frankly, Gabe, this is super helpful for going into your next presentation too. All this background is really important. So time well spent. I wanted to give a shout out to the CAISO. You guys updated your market operations BPM to add back in a lot of I got to give you props and props is deserved, Gabe. So I did want to, there's been some, I know you added back in the state of charge information for IFM earlier this month. That's really helpful also. So thank you so much for making sure that the BPM was up to date. The other public service, this is just purely a public service announcement on the real-time calculations. Flexible ramping up and down are also included in the AS data charge calculation for real-time. And I thought the MSC might be interested in just having that background as well. And I agree with the way you characterize the constraints, Gabe, that largely in day ahead, it's ideally ensuring that the awards are feasible based on how the day ahead market is awarding in earlier intervals. I think that when we talk about your next presentation, it'll be clear why that multiplier, how it interacts with this constraint is really critical to think through. And in real time, it definitely does impact dispatches that the energy offers are there, as you mentioned. When you said you don't, I think the biggest concern with market operations and dispatches relative to the AS constraint has more to do with how the storage operator has managed their stated charge going into those 15-minute market and 5-minute market runs. So if we are well aware as a storage operator that this constraint is in play and that this is the requirement in the market to have 50%, it is our, the storage operator's responsibility to come in with the stated charge so that the constraint doesn't bind and drive uneconomic dispatches. So given the real-time horizon, we just need to be mindful that there is both the storage operator and the CAISO market operations have to work together. And I just wanted to make that public service announcement.
Yeah, I think those are both really good comments. You're absolutely right. There was I think 2 subsections in the business practice manual related to stated charge that had mysteriously disappeared from the BPM. Unfortunately, I think there was a copy and paste incident in I think 2 versions ago. We did get that cleaned up. So if there are things you've sort of been scratching your head about and seem to have been missing, they are back in there. And I agree with your other comment about working on ensuring stated charges there while providing AS. And I totally agree that's something we're just going to have to continue to iterate on and continue to improve.
That sounds good. And I recognize flexible ramping is probably a level of complexity for your example that you didn't want to share, right. But it's fair to realize that you can receive flexible ramp awards as well, and that they will impact constraint functions. Awesome. Thanks, Gabe.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think that's something we'll add in the paper and just make that caveat. Okay, any other questions or comments in the queue?
Not at the moment.
Ben, anything on your side on the MSC?
I don't have anything, but Jim or Scott?
No questions from Scott.
Okay.
Let's see, I guess the equation in page 4, the 0.5, I know that this is not a precise scientific exercise, but do you think 30 minutes and 60 minutes is enough? Is the right number? 0.5 is the right number? What would be the impact of less or more? Would that be something that would be revisited in the future?
Yeah, I think it's something that we as the ISO may want to think about. It is kind of interesting because, and Bill can speak more knowledgeably about this than I can, but the language in the tariff that specifies that you have to be able to provide, whatever service you're awarded in the day ahead in the real-time market, predates storage by a long time. So, rethinking about that and thinking about how it would apply to storage resources could potentially be something in the future, particularly since we're spending so much time, thinking about how this equation is written today and how it's impacting our markets and some of our outcomes. So I think that's a valid question and something we may take up in the future.
10 or 15 years ago, we did I think it was the regulation energy management, and so some resources were going to be allowed to have just 15 minutes. May flywheels rest in peace, of course. But there's clearly some sense at that time that, you didn't need to have all of them have that amount of energy and storage, and I gather the REM constraint has never been binding or close to it, so that's just been sleeping there. So anyway, that's an indication that revisiting it is possible, but having it in the tariff means, of course, it's not just something that the ISO can just quickly change if they if operators think it would be desirable to do so. We love stakeholder processes, but they do have a cost.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, that's all I had, Jim or Scott.
Okay.
I'm fine.
Okay, I guess carry on there, Gabe.
Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, one more, please, I think. I think if we can advance the next slide, this is the one I just went over. Maybe it didn't update on my screen. Okay, perfect. There we are. Okay, great. Okay, so the current ancillary service data charge constraint and our bid cost recovery rules that we have in place today could potentially set up a situation where there's significant uplift payments. So the constraint, as we've just heard, could potentially force storage resources to charge or discharge, and those instructions to charge or discharge energy awards could potentially be out of merit. I think the classic example could be that, you're bidding, and in fact, the example that we've actually seen is that a resource is providing regulation down. That resource has to have a certain amount of headroom in their state of charge. Once they exceed that headroom, the ISO, because of this constraint, actually awards discharge energy awards. The resource, for whatever reason, may be bidding in very high values, maybe $1,000 per megawatt hour, because they're not really interested in discharging energy. They want to just provide the regulating service, regulation down. And once those resources are being discharged for energy because they're just bumping into that constraint, if those awards are uneconomic, all of those payments are eligible for bid cost recovery. So if actual prices are $50 per megawatt hour on the system, the bids are $1,000 per megawatt hour, the resource could be awarded for that particular interval $950 per megawatt hour because of the uneconomic discharges, and that would be paid by uplift. Now, obviously, if we're just talking about one 5-minute interval, the way that our bid cost recovery mechanism works today is everything is looked at on a 24-hour basis. So you could potentially have a few of these intervals, and you could be, making money on the day versus your bids. And if that's the case, you're really not paid any uplift. But if this sort of paradigm happens during a lot of intervals, so let's say you go into the start of the day in the real-time market, and you're right up against that threshold, and you're sort of bumping into it all day, and you do have these very high bids in the market, that's potentially when you could earn or extract a lot of uplift payments, because all day, every time you're being used for that regulation down, you're charging the resource up above that threshold, and then the constraint is dispatching you for energy to get you back to the threshold, so you're not exceeding it. And you're getting paid uplift on every single one of those energy awards. So let's move on to the next slide. So, and I think, originally Department of Market Monitoring flagged this. They were reviewing ancillary service payments to storage resources. You typically think that, storage resources wouldn't be resources that typically get very high bid cost recovery payments. They don't have startup costs. They don't have no load costs. Yes, occasionally they could get a exceptional dispatch or something like that, which could result in uplift. But you typically, don't see a lot of real-time uplift to storage resources. They flagged, there were a number of days that they flagged where storage resources were receiving large uplift payments, and they brought this to the ISO's attention, and sort of our response to that was to implement this tariff language. And the idea here is that when the storage resources are receiving uplift payments because of these energy dispatches, they basically wouldn't be eligible to receive uplift at these times. And I think, what we have today where these additional uplift costs are incorporated and given to storage resources is distortionary, because if you really do have a storage resource that doesn't have the necessary amount of stated charge to be able to provide the ancillary service that it's awarded, it shouldn't be the market's responsibility to compensate the resource at whatever price they're bidding. It really should be the responsibility of the storage resource or the storage resource operator to go out and make sure they have that stated charge when they're operating their resource in the market. And those additional costs or potential additional costs of perhaps having to charge or discharge the resource, depending on what service they're providing, should really be baked into the ancillary service prices in the first place. Okay, I will stop here and take any more questions, and then we will get into what the actual changes that we filed at FERC, which is a filing that we made today, and then I will turn it over to Bill to talk about those. So, operator, any questions on the line?
It looks like we have a couple of questions. Alma, before you jump in, could I just ask a quick question? So elsewhere in the energy storage enhancements proposal, it's proposed to deal with opportunity costs associated with exceptional dispatch by constructing a counterfactual after the day is over, and what did that energy really cost you? And so, not include opportunity cost bids in that, but just, understanding the physics of the battery and the various actual real costs, not opportunity costs. Is there any reason not to do this here? So let's say that somebody bids a very high opportunity cost,
based bids as $1,000. They wind up they wind up having to be discharged. They get a bid cost recovery based on that $1,000 opportunity cost. But in reality, if you look at the end of the day, that opportunity cost was really not anywhere, near $1,000. It was probably a lot less. Is there any reason why that philosophy, the philosophy used, the counterfactual philosophy used in the exceptional dispatch proposal, couldn't also be applicable here to figure out, well, what really were your costs, marginal costs of opportunity costs in that interval, as opposed to what you offered, which which are impossible to, I think, or are very difficult to verify.
Yeah, I think we actually had a number of conversations, kind of about that exactly prior to putting pen to paper on this particular solution. And I think it could potentially be reasonable, but I think as we were thinking more about it, that solution could also be distortionary. So if you've got a resource that really does have a $200 per megawatt hour opportunity cost to charge at a given time, and this constraint is actually charging the resource, or let's say discharge, not to charge, and this constraint is actually discharging the resource, then that whatever the difference is between that dollars and the price is then being uplifted through bid cost recovery if at the end of the day they didn't make up all their bids for the awards that they got in the real-time market, and load effectively pays for that difference. And I think it would be more efficient, and you guys probably could weigh in on this, if those costs, the actual cost to discharge the energy based on the LMP, was baked into the actual bid from the resource that's providing the ancillary service in the first place.
Yeah, and that, of course, is if they're doing it honestly, they're not trying to get a very high bid in order to get BCR. But if they're doing it based on their best guess of what future prices would be, perhaps. But I just see so much opportunity here for manipulation that I'm loath to just say, well, bake it into the ancillary service bids, but we have no way to really verify them in terms of, your beliefs are correct or not, except by this kind of ex post counterfactual calculation that you're using in the ED, that you're proposing to use in the exceptional dispatch proposal.
But then we only need to worry about that if they have market power. Because if they don't have market power, we just don't take the bid if they bid high. So I think Gabe's point is they can solve this problem. If they're a high-cost resource for providing regulation and they offer high, we won't take them. So it's really only an issue if they've got market power, and then we have to mitigate them down to what's their true cost to providing regulation and da-da-da-da.
And we don't have locational market power for ancillary service or regulation anyway. So that's an excellent point. So there would be.
I think we're also.
Go ahead.
I was going to say too. I think we're missing a key point in the comparison between the exceptional dispatch proposal and here, and that's that the exceptional dispatch proposal is not exceptional dispatches to charge or discharge, but to hold state of charge. That's only the narrow type where we're talking about, where there would be no other settlement.
Right. Yeah. I was only referring to the general philosophy of after the fact, looking at what a reasonable counterfactual would have been, what he would have done otherwise, what the actual opportunity cost was, as opposed to what you said it was. But that's a good point. I've probably taken enough time in this. I don't know if Scott or Jim, you want to add on to this before we go to Alba, who I
cut in front of line on.
I'm fine to listen to Alva and others. Yep.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. Alva, my apologies for delaying things.
Not at all. It was actually very consistent. I would just comment, first of all, I think a counterfactual based on regulation instructions is very unlikely. So that's really what you're talking about in terms of comparing, how the resource might have been operated in one situation or another. Is you'd have to compare the discharge along with the regulation instructions in order to make a calculation like that. So I don't think a counterfactual is a good approach in this case. But I think the punchline of, and we've only had a day to look at this, so I think we're very strapped for trying to come up with a response. But I have several qualms with this. I think one possible resolution is, rather than using the bids for this kind of particular use of bids to take a battery back to an acceptable state of charge, use the default energy bids, which are supposed to be cost-based bids in some sense, and use them to do bid cost recovery. Because I think excluding these periods from bid cost recovery altogether places a lot of exposure on the batteries. If you think about it, on the other side, where there would be a need for charging, there could be charging at any price, and the battery would be exposed to that price. I have to say I don't entirely agree with Gabriel and Kathleen's characterization of that the battery operator manages state of charge, given that when a battery has full regulation awards or near full regulation awards and possibly energy awards from the day ahead, there is very limited opportunity without unilaterally scheduling on top of the ISO schedules to manage the battery state of charge. And that's especially looking at a solution that is evolving over multiple hours. So I think CAISO should recognize that this is not a situation that is entirely under the control of the battery operator, and look at whether they are subjecting the battery to undue exposure to real-time prices by proposing that they're going to exclude these periods. The other question comes is, there are two other issues. One is the awards may only partly be used to address the concern. Another portion of the award might simply be used economically. That's one thing that may happen that may cause some issues with this. And the other is that any discharge or charge that is happening in the market processes is going to affect the prices. And so you have a situation where these charge and discharge schedules are not are participating in the price setting, and then are being excluded from the BCR process entirely. So again, these are very off the cuff, but I find the idea of excluding these periods from bid cost recovery altogether to really be an unwarranted exposure to the batteries that are providing regulation to the system. I mean, one obvious solution is to try to really restrict the amount of regulation you provide. I really don't think you want that as the outcome of this. So, and I don't entirely agree with the idea that it can all be baked into the prices either. I don't think we've seen it this risk properly baked into the prices historically. In fact, I think the regulation down prices would probably be higher than they are if this risk were truly baked in. But I don't think necessarily it should be baked in. I think to Ben's point, you'd rather see something which is more purely cost-based in the ancillary service bids, and then find a way to properly compensate for this type of action. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alva. I think those are all good things. We've thought a lot about kind of those kind of topics internally. I think we'll continue to think about them, but I definitely appreciate you bringing them up in this call.
I still like your comment, Gabe, that if these uplift costs and the costs of replenishing the energy are part of the cost of providing regulation, so they should be they haven't been baked into the price because the people didn't bear it. And if the people have to bear those costs, they will bake it into their offer prices. And then if they're a very high cost of providing regulation, they won't. And of course, they're not going to be a high cost for regulation if they don't put in $1,000 bid. So they can also solve the problem by not putting in a $1,000 bid and putting in a bid that's at a lower level. And we can, and they can figure that out, it seems to me. So I kind of like your point originally, that not providing an uplift for the regulation part is good. I do think all of us got a point, though, on how are we going to distinguish whether the instruction was for regulation or for something else. If the unit's got multiple schedules, it isn't, we got an optimization solution and we don't necessarily know exactly what it was doing. I mean, maybe we can make guesses, but I'd like to hear what you have in mind for that.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Basically, what we'd be doing is simplifying the problem. We'd be looking at those two constraints that I outlined on my slides, and we'd be looking at the shadow price. So essentially, if there's a non-zero shadow price on one of those constraints, that would be one 5-minute interval where the resource would be excluded from receiving bid cost recovery. Now, there could be exclusions to that rule. If they were also getting an exceptional dispatch award at the same time, you'd still get bid or better because of the exceptional dispatch, and these rules wouldn't apply. But generally, if you're providing AS, you've got a binding shadow price on this constraint. Those would be the intervals when a particular storage resource wouldn't be eligible to be paid bid cost recovery.
Thanks.
Yep.
One thought I had, and I have no idea. I'm wondering whether there are asymmetric risks where the chance of pretty deep deployment or a use of regulation one direction or another is higher on high stress days or high price days. So there's a certain risk that's borne by the regulation provider that's asymmetric and bigger when the price consequences are really big, and by asking them to bake it into their regulation bid and absorb the risk, if they're really risk averse, would that result in very high bids? I have no idea whether that's true. Whether regulation deployment is at all correlated with stressful conditions and if there are economic consequences, but I was wondering if that might be a possibility.
Yeah, I think that could be a possibility. We haven't done any analytics or anything on that, but I would tend to agree that could be something that would happen.
But it still seems to be the case that Gabe's point is valid, that if that's the case and they're a bad resource on a bad day, then they should do something else and other resources should provide it. And making an appropriate offer price will let the software choose the best outcome.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I see, I think Kathleen is next. Is that correct?
I believe so. Thanks, Ben. It's Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. So a couple comments. And we've gone a couple different ways because so I wanted to respond, Ben, to your question from earlier about the 50%. Is it the right number? Is it not the right number? But we've moved a bit away from that. So I'm open to Gabe or Ben, you saying that it's too long since then to respond to that, but I will look for directions.
This is Bill. Maybe I'll get ahead of it and say that it's based on the 30-minute requirement, which is what's in the tariff now, and has been for as long as can be. I mean, I think we're all agreed that there's a better argument for spin and non-spin for that requirement than perhaps there is for reg, especially reg down. But maybe let us look into it long term. It might be. It likely originates from NERC and NASB standards as well. So we'd have to get into it and also talk to operations about their comfort there.
That's all well, okay, that's helpful, Bill. But the context I wanted to provide is that I do believe this is in scope of energy storage enhancement. So my understanding is we are evaluating this policy question currently. So I did have some heartburn when I heard long-term, because we have repeatedly put in comments and spoken on the stakeholder calls about the interaction between the stated charge calculation and this constraint. And if we are going to be including a multiplier, assuming historical deployment for regulation in the stated charge calculation, it is essential that we also include this multiplier in the AF stated charge constraints. If you can move back slides and just look at the real-time calculation real quick. If you do not update this 50% that is on this slide to that multiplier, so Gabe has put out data on what that multiplier might look like. I'm going to pick a random number to say, let's say for this operating day, it's 20% for this hour. If that is what is being considered on the stated charge side, I have some major concerns with what the AF stated charge constraint is doing to drive the energy dispatches to comply with it if it is requiring 50%. I have a very much starker concern for the day ahead, because that AF stated charge constraint requires 100%. And in the stated charge calculation, we're now going to be removing that, let's say, assume 20% in the stated charge calculation. And I'm concerned that the interaction of these two things will be infeasible in the market. So I respect that it's something that you need to research, but we need to make sure we are not making market rule changes that interact. To this point, you're going to go through and give an example of unintended outcomes or an outcome you weren't expecting. So we need to be very careful when we're proposing changes to an input calculation to this constraint, which you are proposing in the energy storage enhancement. And so the feedback that Vistra has given over the last few months is, why are we not, do we want to consider the multiple ancillary service types, both the spin, non-spin, and regulation, and maybe they need separate multipliers based on their historical. The other feedback we've given is how, we've asked how frequently are we calculating it, and how would we be factoring in under a day-ahead market enhancement if we add in balance reserves? Because as I mentioned, flexible ramping is included in this calculation, and I assume imbalance reserves would be if that gets adopted. And this is something that is in scope of the effort, and I definitely think we need to get MSC feedback on how all of these things interplay. It's complicated, very complex, and the more that we add new products to the calculation, the more complex it will become. But so I wanted to make sure that the MSC was aware that stakeholders have asked for this discussion to be in scope of the existing effort.
Yeah, and I think, so I do appreciate that comment, Kathleen. We may want to hold off on having, a deeper dive of that discussion until we get to the slides where we're actually talking about the other stated charge formula. But I totally agree with you. The other stated charge formula where we're actually talking about awards that govern what stated charge the market calculates the storage resources to be at does impact this constraint formula, which is also, an aspect of our market that we will be observing. So there are some interactions here. And I think the third point, and this is kind of Bill's point, while there's also this requirement that our tariff currently says, not just storage resources, all resources have to have at least 30 minutes or be able to provide an ancillary service for at least 30 minutes if they're awarded that in the real-time market, which I think is what's driving the constraint that we're talking about here, which I'm with you. These are all interrelated, and we do need to think about them. But I am a little bit reluctant to take up policy that's going to govern, requirements that impact all resources, not just storage resources, in a policy that's supposed to be thinking only about storage resources.
That's fair. And
there's interaction.
Just to lean in. Oh, sorry, Gabe. I'll take what Bill said on face value and say if I'm understanding you correctly, Bill, I'm actually, what I hear you say is the proposal for the multiplier to be dynamic in a state of charge calculation may not be feasible because you have a separate NERC requirement that you need to track down. So I'm trying to take what you're on the AS state of charge constraint and flip it to the state of charge calculation proposal. When so keep them connected. When you say it has to be, you think it has to be 50%, we really need that research because we need to figure out if the proposal that you're going to go through later is doable. But I don't want to belabor this point. I just wanted to flag that it's the multiplier right now. To then question, we're marching down the road of this multiplier that CAISO's proposing is a more accurate percent to be included in that state of charge constraint, because that is what the CAISO has shown data is a better approximation for what we could expect to be used. So that's how we have moved through the stakeholder process, assuming that that multiplier is the right value moving forward. But I also want to respond to the specific content here and make a couple comments about caution. Just, again, this is very complex. Yes, we spend a lot of time trying to understand, but these are new resources. A lot of us are new, trying to figure out how the market functionality works for these resources. So I think it's important to come to this with that perspective of we're all learning, and the operations over the last couple of weeks have stress tested both the market design and the assets themselves. With that major caveat, we have asked the CAISO to, in the energy storage project itself, to kind of pause and let's do a lessons learned, spend some time with them and with you, the MSC, looking through data and trying to understand these inflection points in the market design that just maybe didn't work out very well or needs to be revisited. I perceive this filing as an example of something the CAISO has already identified and that they want to accelerate to the front of the queue in that review, and I respect that as a part of the lessons learned and what we're trying to address. But I did want to emphasize that we're all learning how this market functionality impacts, especially in these edge cases. I do think it's important to recognize that storage operators need to be able to reflect the risk in real time through their offers in order to manage their state of charge. The goal is not to have this constraint drive an uneconomic dispatch. The goal is to have your offers result in you having a sufficient state of charge consistent with your awards, right? And consistent with what this constraint is requiring. But I want to be very transparent that that's challenging, especially under mitigation. And we've had concerns with the storage debt and how that is working in mitigation, which multiple folks have raised, that we need a deep dive on that. When a storage asset is mitigated, it's very difficult to ensure that that risk is reflected in those offers and to ensure that we can best manage that data charge to meet these requirements. The other thing that makes this very difficult is when the minimum state of charge constraint is in play. We've already talked about how complex this shit is. If you then take that and add on top of that the minimum state of charge constraint, we're very concerned with the interaction between the AS state of charge constraint and the minimum state of charge constraint when they're both in effect and affecting storage assets. And we don't think that's been looked at in great enough detail either. I use these as examples of the CAISO has constraints that do state of charge management in its market. Understood. These add some complexities to trying to manage that state of charge on our own, which we've raised. We believe that we are better suited to manage the state of charge through our offers to avoid these types of concerns, but the limitations on the ability to reflect those offers and the interaction with the MSOC can be very challenging. So there's just a couple other pieces of feedback to raise for folks to consider how complex and difficult this is to evaluate quickly, and that we think we need to take time to really parse through it. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Kathleen. No, I do appreciate that feedback. Any other callers in the queue?
Yes, I think we have Grant McDaniel. Grant?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, Grant McDaniel with Wellhead. So, I think that a part of me kind of sees what Alva was explaining as being probably the most efficient way to deal with this. And the reason why is that, if you use the DEBs during this period, and then you say that you're eligible to have the uplift, that kind of ensures that you're going to get cost recovery, but also that the bids are going to be put in a way that's efficient. The problem that I see or be concerned about in pricing this into your AS bid is that during tight conditions, I have a $1,000 cap on my energy, which could go to $2,000 in real time, and I've got a $250 on the AS. And so does that then lead to shortages of certain AS products in real time because, you want to go price yourself somewhere else in the market, right? You don't want to provide the AS services because I can't put all the risk on the AS bid. And it's just a concern. I don't know if you've thought about it, Gabe, but anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Grant. Appreciate the feedback.
So yeah, I definitely see that. If you're fairly certain that you're going to be hitting $1,000 energy, and you're going to have to charge that I guess it depends how many megawatt hours per megawatt per hour you would wind up having to recharge and pay that. So I just wanted to point out that the DEBs, this is, as we all know, of course, the DEBs for storage are much more complicated and arbitrary beasts than DEBs, say, for something with a heat rate and gas costs. So I think that there are other issues with DEBs which we may get to be talking later about in this meeting. But the DEBs based on opportunity costs, which are based on, say, day-ahead prices, and now we're in the middle of the day and conditions are quite different. The relevance of DEBs to actual opportunity costs may be fairly remote. But this is a discussion that I think we should save for when we're in the DEBs portion of Gabe's proposal. Okay, let's see. I see Sergio and would you like to unmute and go ahead?
Yeah. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. This is Sergio Dueñas with the California Energy Storage Alliance, CISA. So I think broadly we definitely appreciate and understand the ISO's concern with identifying a situation that has the potential for being used in a particular way and solving it quickly. It does make sense to try to close what could be seen in some situations as specific loophole. But I think that we do agree generally with what Alba was saying at first. For something that seems to be a narrowly defined problem, this is not really a very narrowly defined solution. In the filing specifically, the ISO notes that there have been about 6 incidents where BCR payments to storage reached over $250,000. But in this situation, with what is proposed here, it would seem that not even this wouldn't incent resources to not bid near the cap to show the opportunity cost of this situation, but rather it would eliminate any opportunity for VCR, even if they don't bid near the cap, right? Like, even if the bid is consistent with what would be the opportunity cost, there is no VCR. And here I'd like to just comment quickly on the idea of if this could be incorporated into the AS bids themselves beforehand. I would say that's it gets really to a key challenge with storage, because contrary to a resource with a hit rate, to a conventional asset, the cost of providing a particular service will always be contingent on the cost of energy when it was procured by the storage asset, when charged, but also the relative cost of providing any other service. Essentially, the opportunity cost of the resource for storage, assuming that it would be reasonable for that to just be priced into the AS, is almost assuming that the storage operator will know real-time conditions better than the ISO. Because the prices of energy will affect the actual opportunity cost of the assets. So I would appreciate if we can think of ways in which this proposal could be further tuned, since it does seem like outright disallowing VCR doesn't incent better bidding, bidding that is more consistent with either costs, or it eliminates the opportunity of the assets to use their bids as a way to indicate the importance of that opportunity cost a bit further. But thank you for that, and I welcome any questions. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Sergio. I think your points are well taken. The one thing I would just specify is that, when we're talking about the bid cost recovery payments here, we're only, and I'm sure you know this, but we're only talking about bid cost recovery payments made to storage resources that are providing AS. We're not talking about typical, anything else outside of the ancillary service space for this particular filing. And the other thing I just wanted to note is, and I do have, I think, a slide or two on this, but in the next steps, we are going to be opening up a stakeholder initiative, and, we're going to work through the details of this particular constraint and sort of how we want to, think about enforcing this and rules for bid cost recovery going forward. And that would follow a more normal stakeholder process where the ISO would put together a straw proposal. We'd hear feedback from stakeholders, and then we'd start to iterate on that, and then eventually, hopefully, have a discussion like this with the MSC with that solution, and then take it to the Board of Governors, and then eventually implement it.
So very quick follow-up to that, Gabe. In the filing, the red line language that is to be included to the section 11.6.6 for settlements, it says, where the case of dispatches storage resources participating as NGR to charge or discharge pursuant to the other sections where you define this constraint, they will be ineligible for RTM bid cost shortfalls. So I assume that this is what you are imagining would be assessed a bit further in the stakeholder process you just mentioned. But this doesn't tell the community if this is temporary, if this is while we identify another solution, if this is when any of the bids are $1 above the LMP, so maybe that opportunity cost was, it's not on it. There's different degrees of reasonableness to what bid is being placed in that particular interval, right? If you bid at close to the cap, it's just because you don't want to lose energy for future dispatch. But if your bid would have fallen into reasonable VCR, this is completely disallowed by this provision, correct? So if there is an intent to further explore this in another initiative, would this provision be temporary? Is that considered? We just want a bit more information, but thanks, Gabe.
So thanks for those questions. Let me put a pin in those because I think it's a great segue into Bill's section where he's actually going to talk about the tariff language.
I would just correct the record too on what Sergio said. I'm not sure where you got the 6 instances. Maybe you're just looking at the graph that we saw when single resources in a single day reached over 250,000. But this is pretty pervasive. This is not isolated incidents. And now, like these BCR payments represent well over half all the BCR revenues storage has received over the year.
Yeah. So first of all, I would say it was a bit hard to listen to you, Bill. The audio is a bit choppy, but if I understood your comment correctly on where did I get that data on like how often it's happening or not, I thought that was your question. I'm referring to the figure that was included in page 10 of the filing circulated, and there you can see like a bunch of bars basically tell you like how often BCR payments are in different magnitudes, and there seems to be like a lot are under the 50,000, and you have some outlier days that are the ones really referred to in pages 9 and 10 of the filing as this is what DMM caught. So, but sorry if I misunderstood your comment. Maybe the audio was a bit choppy, but thank you.
Yeah, no worries. I think we're just trying to show some representative samples, but as we said, this is becoming a pervasive issue.
Before you do that, Bill, I just wanted to check and see there was another storage enhancements item in the agenda, and it's almost 7:30 Eastern, 4:30 Western. Gabe, do you have a sense of whether we'll want to, after Bill does the tariff language, whether there'll be time to do something meaningful on the other item, or?
I suspect, given where we're at with the time that we have, I don't think we're going to be able to make much progress on energy storage enhancements.
So would you prefer just to hold that for a subsequent meeting?
Yeah.
Perhaps an expanded one in the next one that we have. Okay, which means that we're not terribly pressed for time right now. So Bill, you can go ahead and take the time you want. We can also have discussion. I think Kathleen, I think you had your hand up again, but let's hold questions if you don't mind. Hold questions for after Bill gets through the tariff language, and then we'll have definitely some open time for more Q&A.
Thanks. I don't know if we want to advance slides, but as we do that, I do want to just step back and talk about, the tariff language kind of speaks for itself and is straightforward. I do just want to step back and talk about what happened with the filing generally. CAISO certainly wants to recognize that storage is becoming this incredibly large, important, anything crucial player, especially as we saw in the heat wave on the net load peak. And I think the DMN and CAISO are in agreement that this filing isn't really meant to address something that was specifically intended to exploit a market design issue or do anything like that. Rather that this just represents the learning curve we're all going through with storage resources in an optimization that is largely designed for gas-fired resources. Bid cost recovery, perhaps especially. So just to step back and talk about the filing, Sean or someone could go to the next slide too. It's posted on our website. We sent it to about everyone. We filed today. We asked for an effective date for tomorrow, but that will be made effective through the normal settlement correction timeline. We did that so simply we were informing scheduling coordinators on how to do this more. But we did not ask for an expedited comment period or an expedited order from FERC. So we are on the normal 60-day timeline, although it'll go back into effect tomorrow once approved. DMM already has submitted its comments, so I would encourage anyone to review those as well. They talk about their investigation, the data they're looking at, and how they view where these costs should be recovered. Now going to the next slide, covered here. So you'll only see three tariff provisions. The first is what was implicit within the 30-minute requirement and otherwise spelled out in the BPMs. We've now made express in the tariff, just for full transparency, that the optimization will enforce the 30-minute requirement on storage resources where their state of charge would otherwise run up against the 30-minute requirement in real time. Next slide. Second, you'll simply see two sets of revisions, one on regulation and one on spin and non-spin, simply saying that where the optimization, only in those intervals where the optimization is actually dispatching the resource to meet the, as a result of the ancillary services state of charge constraint, then the storage resource will be ineligible for RTM bid cost shortfalls in those intervals only. Go to the next slide as well. And so this is, you'll see very similar to what we did in Measure 4 with the state of charge bid parameter and the, and when storage resources submit self-schedules, that they're also ineligible for the same bid cost recovery settlement provision. But they're all otherwise still available for all other bid cost recovery in other intervals and the other various charges. Bid cost recovery is actually a summation, I think, of about 24 different settlement charge codes in different intervals, depending on what's happening. But we're really only talking about this narrow band of the RTM bid cost shortfalls in these hours where the optimization is moving the resources to meet the ancillary service requirement. So I'll pause here to see if anyone has any questions on the FERC filing or what we've done in the tariff. I think Sergio's hand is still up from before. I know Kathleen got back in line when when Gabe was still going, but happy to take any questions.
This is Kathleen. I'm unmuted. I was on the line for you, Bill, so this is perfect timing. So Kathleen from Pitcher, just a reminder. First, my comments on the tariff language, feedback for you. Not this section. Let's go back to the last slide. So first question, I have a question. My understanding is that similar to what we talked about earlier, providing all that background, the AS data charge constraint that's in the integrated forward market isn't really, so there's no impact on, it's not really doing much other than ensuring a feasible IFM award given that constraint. So I don't believe it results in additional energy awards being awarded in IFM, but I would ask the CAISO to confirm that. That is what I heard Gabe saying. That is that's what I think happens. But like I said, we haven't really edge cased the IFM on this kind of issue. Has the CAISO explicitly ruled out that there is any IFM concern on this?
Well, I don't know if I want to go that far, but I will clarify that our tariff filing is real-time market only.
think that is logical. I just wanted to make sure that that the reason why IFM is not being included is because we do not think that it is resulting in uneconomic energy IFM awards. Just limitations on what the economic IFM awards could be. So assuming that's correct, I think it's logical, but it would be helpful for the CAISO to take that back and confirm that for stakeholders. My second piece of feedback for you is, okay, now focusing on the real-time market AS data charge constraint. As we've discussed, it's not the full ancillary service schedule for that hour. So the AS award for that hour, it is only currently 50%. I think your language here, unless you have in Appendix A some definition for the capitalized ancillary services schedule that says it's just the 50%, seems to imply 100%, not 50%. So my second question is, can you confirm if ancillary services schedule is a defined term by which I should be understanding it's the 50%?
Ancillary service schedule is a defined term. I mean, whether that defined term gets you to 50% is a whole other issue. But yes, I mean, the optimization is enforcing the 30-minute requirement. And so I think if you look in the filing, you'll see, we've created some hypotheticals, some model resources based on what we're actually seeing in the optimization. And you'll see, it's not just like a straight, discharge for a long time. It's really up and down, trying to just create the tiniest amount of headroom based on that 50% requirement.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. So the definition of your defined term is the notification by the CAISO indicating that a submission to self-provide an ancillary service has been selected to provide such service in the day-ahead market or real-time market, because I only see ancillary service schedule or AS schedule as this definition. A submission to self-provide an AS has been selected to provide such service in the day-ahead market or real-time market. That seemed a little confusing. Could you clarify that it's not meant to refer to a this isn't a self-schedule, right? We're just talking about normal energy offers.
Well, you usually self-schedule a couple of places. I mean, if they're also self-providing ancillary services, they will be subject to the constraint, and they could be moved this way, and they would be subject, they would be prevented from receiving state cost recovery in those intervals where the optimization moves, regardless of whether they did AS or self-provided AS. If they have a self-schedule for energy behind their AS award,
let's not get, I'm not trying to complicate it. I'm literally trying to confirm that when you look through the tariff definition of AS schedule, it's self-provided AS, and self-provided, my understanding of that was that is a self-scheduled AS. So I'm confused about the language, and I'm just looking for clarity. Because in real time,
let's talk offline on that, because this could also be a concatenated term where you're looking at an AS schedule definition. Really, we're talking about the AS definition, which is everything, and the schedule definition, which is all by itself and just means schedule and just means AS over here.
Yeah, I think that would be great. Because I think it's really, it's not clear to me from your tariff language right now if the rules that you're proposing are only for self-provided AS, and I'm not sure how we have self-provided AS in this at all. So I'm super confused.
They are not. Yeah, they are not for self-provided AS only. It would also be if you did AS.
Okay, so that is a really helpful clarification. So my feedback is this is a little unclear. And the other piece of feedback is that what the AS data charge constraint is protecting is 50% of the ancillary service awards that have previously been received. And if that is what this language means, then great. But if this is not, and by great, I just mean at least I know what this language means. But I don't see that written here. And that's my piece of feedback I wanted to provide, specifically since we haven't had a tariff. We didn't have a chance for stakeholder meetings on the tariff language. This is feedback that we want to provide, that this language is not super clear and that it shouldn't be read to change the AS data charge formulation that's being discussed in the energy storage enhancements effort.
Well, yeah. So first, I would say, I mean, you're kind of just looking at the revision. The constraint that we're talking about is just the preceding sentence which is an existing tariff provision saying that, you know, in this case, we're looking at spin. For non-spinning reserve, they have to be able to meet that schedule. They have to be able to meet that for 30 minutes.
And if I'm not being, I think I'm not being clear, so I'll just try and say this one more time, and then I'll defer to other callers. The words in the real-time market where storage resource using the non-generator resource model will not have sufficient state of charge to meet its ancillary service schedule, CAISO will dispatch the storage resource to have sufficient state of charge to meet its ancillary service schedule would only be accurate to me if it instead was phrased as where a storage resource using the NGR model will not have sufficient state of charge to meet its required portion of the ancillary services schedule. The CAISO will dispatch the storage resource to have sufficient state of charge to meet its required portion of the AS schedule. That would mean to me what the equation is doing, and that's the feedback that I want to provide at this time. I will just say that whether or not an appropriate tariff filing, we are reviewing and we will look at DMM's comments, but we've only had one day to look at this, and we will, I think my last question, Bill, is I believe that based on your procedural steps here, that any further discussion from a stakeholder perspective is really going to be held through the FERC paper proceeding, and can you please confirm that?
No, I can't confirm that because, you have my number, Kathleen. You can talk to me whenever you want. And I think we certainly understand that you've only had one day to review. That's why Gabe and I are talking about this on an MSC call, is so that we can, have a short communication with stakeholders. But that's not to say that we can't have more communication with stakeholders, both within and outside of the FERC proceeding. Going back to the tariff language, though, I mean, I see where you're coming from. I think that level of specificity isn't required, and it's implicit in what we said. But ultimately, I do want to just clarify, though, that our filing did not change the constraints for the optimization, right? Or put another way, we're not making any software changes to the optimization on this point. The only changes we're making are on the bid cost recovery calculation. So I hope that clarifies things.
I appreciate the clarity. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Bill. I think we're done with the tariff revisions. Is that correct?
Yep. I think that's it. Pretty straightforward for the optimization and settlements. I think it could have been a lot more slides.
Okay, that's great. Let's see. I think there's another slide just to wrap. A wrap up. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Next steps. All yours, Gabe.
I think we've kind of hit on this already, and I'm aware it's late your time. I don't envy you guys on the East Coast. This meeting does officially mark the start of the ancillary service state of charge constraint stakeholder initiative. So similar to other stakeholder initiatives, we will have a straw proposal. We'll iterate on it, and we'll be basing that straw proposal off of the language that we're currently filing, or we just filed today, and we'll sort of be progressing forward from there with additional ideas on how this policy might be improved. I'm hoping that this is a somewhat narrowly defined issue. I'm thinking it's going to be hopefully one of the briefer stakeholder policy proposals and series of back and forths. Obviously, we'll take as long as we need to get this done, but we do want to. We're going to try at least to move swiftly and have something out relatively soon that can be discussed publicly, that we can potentially iterate on, and we're certainly going to be taking feedback that we're hearing from this meeting and incorporating that into the first straw proposal that we put together. The stakeholder process could potentially result in amendments to the rules that we're filing today. Of course, it could also not result in any changes. We could say, yes, the rules that we're putting in today are just fine, and we're gonna keep those in place, and we don't need to make any changes, and that could be another alternative outcome. But we're not, going to prejudge that either way, and we're certainly keeping an open mind. And I like a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about already today, and we'll try to see if we can incorporate those. So with that, Ben, I think it wraps up everything I wanted to talk about with this particular filing. And I know we have a whole other slide deck on energy storage enhancements, which we certainly don't have time to get through today. But I've been talking with Shami Davis online, who is coordinating these meetings, and she said we likely have some time in the agenda next Monday, so we might be able to get to that discussion then. One of the things that we've heard from a lot of the stakeholders is, how do all of these constraints interact together? And I haven't developed any slides on that, but that could be something that we also discuss at that meeting next Monday.
Gabe, I'm grateful for your flexibility, and if 2 meetings in a week can be counted as fortunate, I think we are fortunate that this is only delayed a week, and they'll still be close to this discussion. And I look forward to also your discussion of the issues of the interaction of the various moving pieces of this initiative. So I'll just check and see if there are any attendees who have further questions. We've had some, I think, very helpful discussion. So I see Sean Hernandez. If you would like to unmute.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Quick question on these dispatches, the ancillary service dispatches. Would the energy, I'm thinking of it as like the corrective dispatch to get to the right SOC. Would the energy for the corrective dispatch fall into the bucket of regulation energy or of expected energy if I were looking for it in my settlement data?
These are typical energy awards that you'd see in the RTD timeframe. So they'd be just.
And so, according to the bidding rules, like the bid validation, there must be a segment which the corrective energy falls into on the bid curve, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Great question. Thanks, Sean.
Okay. Any other questions? Anybody else like to get in queue? Okay. Appreciate all of your involvement. And so we'll see many of you next week, and certainly see you next week as well, Gabe. Thank you, Bill, for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you for the first time. I hope it's not the last. And so with that, we will conclude the call, unless Jim or Scott, you have anything else you would like to add?
Nothing from Scott.
Nothing.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks, staff, attendees, and members of the MSC, and we'll see you next week. Operator, we can end the call.
Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.